Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first workshop of the 2025 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. This is the virtual workshop series, and I'm Leasi Vanessa Lee Raymond. I'm the Deputy Director for Strategic Initiatives at Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and we're the primary sponsor for this workshop series. And I will be your MC today, so thank you for joining us. It's morning where I am, so I'll say good morning. So as a reminder, this is the first of 4 virtual workshops held this spring as 2 half-day Zoom sessions. They're free of charge, and they lead up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is taking place in person from June 3rd to 5th at the Denina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. The purpose of these workshops is to take a deeper dive. And so we're going into specific topics that are of current relevance to the energy opportunity and challenges facing Alaska today. The upcoming workshops are on the slide here. We have the Alaska Energy Truisms, a starting point for tough conversations on Alaska's energy future on April 8th through 9th. We have the Dueling Over Dual Use Infrastructure on May 6th and 7th, and I will be participating in that one as well. And then we have the IEEE 1547 Interconnection Standard, enabler of technical innovation and end user benefit, which is happening May 13th and 14th of this year. So this is the 4th year that ACEP has hosted these workshops. We have brought some of the top experts and practitioners together from both inside of Alaska and other places in the US or internationally to present at these workshops with an Alaskan spin, or to at least hear from speakers with information we think is highly relevant to an Alaskan audience. Previous topics have included nuclear energy in Alaska, ocean and river energy, hydrogen, low carbon energy transitions, carbon capture and sequestration, and energy storage. Those workshops were recorded and they're still accessible online on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website. We have posted a link in the chat in case you want to revisit any of these topics. And there's a lot of terrific and still relevant information. So if you're interested in learning more about these topics from the perspective of what could work in Alaska, please revisit this content. It's still relevant today, for sure. Okay, so for today, we are here for the Information Security for Electric Utilities workshop. We'll be exploring the unique circumstances of Alaska's electrical utilities and the growing need to protect from cyber threats. Cyber resilience, as it's called, is of unique importance for remote islanded microgrids in Alaska. One, to keep the lights on, the schools warm, the freezers filled with harvested subsistence food safe. But as you'll learn, cyber resilience in Alaska for critical infrastructure like energy systems has national security considerations as well. At ACEP, we're growing our capacity to meet community-run utilities' need for information security techniques, expertise, and eventually the workforce that can do this type of work in community. And you'll hear a little bit about that today. So our conversation today is really framed about information security for electrical utilities and what it means to establish procedures and best practices that are tailored to the Alaskan energy context. This morning, we'll start by hearing from Jamie Lean from Dragos and John Haverlack from ACEP about IT versus OT security, and you'll learn more about those acronyms as well. Their presentation will be followed by Jess Smith from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, focusing on Ukraine's cyber-induced power outages. Very hot topic right now. Followed by Dan Arnold from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, focused on cybersecurity for energy sector research, development, and demonstrations. And closing out the day today with presentations from Todd Ponto, from Scott Madden, and Ed Jenkin from the Railbelt Reliability Council, who are spearheading critical infrastructure protections in Alaska, and Chris Green from Structured, focusing on cybersecurity and compliance at electrical utilities. So that's just today. Tomorrow, the conversation continues as we'll learn more about approaches to cybersecurity and the overlap with national security from Ron Camo from NCIS, followed by a presentation by John Haverlack regarding C2M2 and BIL cybersecurity plan. And again, you'll learn more about those acronyms tomorrow. After the break, we will continue with a presentation from Jamie Lean of Dragos on their community defense program. And again, we're looking at both community and national cybersecurity here in Alaska. And we'll be closing out the day with a presentation by John Haverlack, bringing it all full circle to discuss Alaska's rural microgrid cybersecurity framework. So we're going to start with a poll. We have a few questions for the group to get everyone to know each other. So to participate in today's poll from your computer, you can go to that link, pollev.com/TOTAC 216. And then we recommend you should be using Chrome for the best results, Google Chrome. And the link to the poll is also in the chat. Now you can also participate by phone. You can text TOTAK 216. And then the number to text is 22333. And you'll receive a text message letting you know that you've joined the session. Type and send your response, and the results will pop up on the screen. So first, what we'd like to know is, where are you joining us from? Oh, people are already getting their answers in. So we have Anchorage and Fairbanks and outside of Alaska, but within the US. Oh, wow, a lot of Anchorage signing in. I'm just outside of Anchorage. It's not close enough for me to tell. Any other people signing in? More US outside of Alaska. Someone outside of someone in the Mat-Su. So that's Susitna. And then a few people from outside of the state, lower 48. Oh, okay, we've got someone else in the interior. And a few more people from Fairbanks. And someone calling in from Juneau. That's great. Okay. Our second question, seems like you guys got the hang of it, is how knowledgeable are you on cybersecurity? We got some experts in the room. That's great. It's always good. We have some people who feel pretty familiar, somewhat familiar, and then a few people who are new to this. And so I think you'll get a really wonderful view on how these big concepts like cybersecurity and information security are applied to Alaskan communities. It makes it very real when you're thinking about, the lights that are on in your house. Okay, so the percentages have changed a little bit. It looks like people have a base level of knowledge. Okay, our third question. Who is in our audience today, and what sector do you represent? It's like we have a lot of government people joining, a few utility people, and then we are tied in academia and private sector. So that's great. We're going to have a robust discussion here about how this intersects with lots of different areas. And then our final question is, how concerned are you about cybersecurity? Ooh, wow, okay. We have a very concerned group. I guess I'm in the right place. Well, next, we'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. So please introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. We'd love to know your name and the organization that you're from. If you're having any difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, please chat event support. Just type in event support in the chat box and someone will assist you. And then during the workshop, everyone will be muted. So please submit any questions that you have in the chat, and our moderators will collect and curate those questions for our presenters. They'll be used during the Q&A portion of each section. And then, as we already shared, the recording of this workshop will join the other recordings that we have. So they'll be available at the ASEC website on www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. So if you have to step away or you want to rewatch things or share it with someone else that you work with, you'll be able to do that. So to start off our workshop, I'd like to introduce Governor Dunleavy. Although he is unable to join us live, he was able to provide recorded remarks for today's important workshop. Let's have a listen.
Hello, I'm Governor Mike Dunleavy. Thank you for joining this important workshop on information security for electric utilities. Protecting our energy infrastructure is vital to Alaska's future. Cyber threats to our power grids are real, and we must stay ahead. This workshop will equip you with the tools and knowledge to safeguard our critical infrastructure. Securing our power systems isn't just about preventing cyber attacks, it's about ensuring resilience, reliability, and sustainability for Alaskans. With our unique energy landscape, from microgrids to major utilities, collaboration is key. By sharing strategies, learning from experts, and working together, we can build a stronger, more secure energy sector. The insights from this workshop and the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference will help drive innovation and resilience in our energy systems. Thank you for your dedication to this mission. Your efforts will help keep Alaska powered and secure for generations to come.
Wonderful. And yeah, this workshop and others will help us stay ahead for a resilient Alaska. So thank you, Governor, for those remarks. So this brings us to today's first presentation. During the presentation, please continue to put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them in the Q&A part of this panel. Please join me in welcoming our first presenters of the workshop, Jamie Lean and John Haverlack. Jamie has an interesting story on how she got started in cybersecurity. Her first contact in the world of technology was when she built her first computer at the age of 14, which is not everyone's first contact with technology. As a child, she thought cybersecurity was incredibly interesting, but when she first started college, focusing on cybersecurity, it was apparent the cybersecurity she always thought of was not the norm. That was until she attended an oil and gas cybersecurity event in Texas. Her goal was to broaden her understanding of the industry, discover what she should be focusing on, and what jobs existed in the field. Not even 30 minutes after arriving, she learned about OT and ICS, which I hope you guys will define later, discovering the cybersecurity she always thought of as a kid. And I love that. The cybersecurity she always thought of as a kid. To no surprise, it's exactly where she wanted to be. And after meeting someone at the Dragos booth and learning about this newly discovered sector, she left that event determined to work at Dragos and to be a part of something impactful. 6 months later, she started interning at Dragos as a community defense program advocate, and she now leads CDP full-time at Dragos. John serves as the information security lead for ASAP, where he works closely with researchers and partners to understand and navigate cyber risk, regulations, technical controls, and resources. John is a technology generalist with a degree in physics, experience teaching high school STEM or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And he has provided a wide range of private and public sector information technology services for nearly 30 years. His most recent focus has been on the design, deployment, and maintenance of cyber infrastructure on board the RV Sikuliak. So another interesting angle at cybersecurity. In parallel to his Sikuliak role, Haverlack has also served as a consultant to the U.S. academic research fleet, helping to establish a new cybersecurity program for the fleet. So welcome, Jamie and John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Excuse me.
All right, can you see our slides okay?
I think,
yep.
Yeah,
right.
I'm able to see it pretty good. So I think I'll start it out. That introduction was great. Thank you so much. So as stated, my name is Jamie Lean. I currently work at Dragos as an OT community program coordinator, which just means that I run a really cool program where we give some of our resources out for free. So.
And I'm John Haverlack with the information security lead here at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska here in Fairbanks.
So we're going to be kind of covering the IT versus OT landscape, and IT is the one that most people are familiar with. So you're looking at information technology, you have your hardware, your software, your network systems. IT systems mainly support personal and business. I mean, you have your enterprise, you have all that fancy stuff. It's pretty much the one that people know most. And so this can include your local area networks and just internet-based cloud services as well. But OT, which is the one that I have fallen in love with, is going to be your operational technology. It's a little bit more interactive with the world, a little bit more physical. So it does still involve hardware, software, networking, but you're looking more at how interacting with that is going to interact with the physical world. So these cyber physical systems are used in industrial control systems, ICS, kind of a dual world with OT. And these interact with, like I said, like physical environments. They can actually interact with the world. I mean, your keyboard, if some bad actor is in and they're typing, your keyboard's not attacking you. But if a bad actor gets into a manufacturing plant or let's say an electric facility, they're making things happen that can actually harm you or do something to the physical world. So OT has a good breakdown of some like subsectors in it. So ICS, the industrial control systems. You have your DCS, which is going to be distributed control systems. SCADA, which is pretty popular inside of it, which is going to be your supervisory control and data acquisition. And then IoT is your Internet of Things.
Okay. So when we think about power grids, we might think of a centralized power grid power plant, which in Alaska could be coal-fired, natural gas, or diesel in many rural communities. This slide kind of represents more of a microgrid where you might have a community connection or a community power grid that's not connected to the broader power grid on the rail belt in Alaska. But it could be either. And so we've got sources of power and consumers of power in the power grid, and we have distribution lines to transmit that power. When we talk about cybersecurity, what we're interested in is how these systems are networked together with information networks. So in addition to power transmission lines, we also have communication lines that communicate information between them. Within a power plant, we have industrial control systems that control the cyber physical systems within that power plant. But we might also have solar farms or wind farms, and we need to monitor and measure energy use and consumption to tune it accordingly, or send excess power to a battery storage system. And so we have to think about how we protect all those communication networks and think about what would happen if they get disrupted and how that would impact the functioning of the power system.
And it's important when thinking about these things because of how well they tie in together. So when you talk about the IT versus OT, a lot of people have heard of IT. They sometimes haven't heard of OT, but both of those go into protecting things such as our power plants, microgrids, water facility, electric plants, etc. And so when you really look at the difference between IT and OT, they work together, but each represent different risk profiles. And so they require different approaches when managing them. Like you cannot apply, for example, an incident response plan that you would use in an IT environment in an OT environment. They're not symmetric. It's not like a gaming console. It's not cross compatible with the discs, you know? So when we talk about OT, we talk about that ICS, the DCS, your SCADA. And then IT, you're still dealing with virtual assets. OT, you're combining it and now dealing with those physical assets. The purpose is IT, you typically are going to see in just general computing, communications, you know, your average workday in any office building. But when you're talking about the purposes on the OT side, you're thinking in industry manufacturing, power plants, water, et cetera, like those things that are utilities or are critical infrastructure. And so when you're thinking the internet, OT, you're not going to see internet access. If you are, it's going to be super limited. It'll be exclusively for updates, maybe remote access from vendors when trying to go in it and just see what's going on, and potentially data sharing when you're talking about sending what you're doing to your enterprise, so your IT environments. But IT, you live on the internet. Basically, you are, your risk is pretty high, but it just comes with what you're trying to execute in your job. So email, social media, just browsing the web, things that you typically are required from in your job, that's where the IT side comes in. So when we move on to the user base, like I mentioned, you're thinking like IT, think enterprise. So office buildings, education, your phone, social media is super popular, banking, you know, don't use public Wi-Fi and sign into your bank app at an airport or anywhere. OT, the user base is mainly focused on those engineers, asset owner and operators, technicians. The risk exposure between these two, although IT and OT are both very important in their respective areas, the risk factor does change a little bit. For example, the example that I had given with the keyboard, in IT, your risk exposure, I mean, financial is huge, reputation, loss of identity, supply chain, ransomware. Now, in OT, an OT attack can still cause some financial loss and potentially a hurt to reputation, but the risk exposure now also transitions to physical harm, so human safety, that critical infrastructure. So if it's winter and your electric facility gets attacked and is now down, not only could the attack have been made to try and harm people inside of the plant based on what they did, but now you're looking at potentially a town with thousands of residents with no heat during winter. So on top of that, that can also cause significant damage to human safety, potentially loss. The operating systems you're looking at change a little bit. So operating systems and IT, we're a little bit more hip. So we're going to have Windows, Mac, Linux, you have your mobile OS systems. A lot of OT environments are very, very old. They have not, the O doesn't stand for old, but it might as well. Old technology. So you're looking at old versions of Windows, you're using C's, RTOs. A lot of these things is because everything that was developed back when we started using this has not been updated. A lot of these people, like, you don't have that internet access. You are not having that connection out. So you're looking at things that are using old versions of everything, more difficult to patch. They don't get touched. Their life cycle is significantly different, which is something I believe we'll go over a little bit in the future. Softwares are also different. Obviously, on the IT side, we're more familiar with the softwares we use, like cloud services, email, browsers, office suites. On the OT side, you're looking at HMIs, data historian, and like custom systems, which kind of fit the specific utility you're going after, manufacturing plant, for example, things that kind of fit that specific asset involvement. Hardwares are also going to be different. Again, on the IT side, we're very familiar with our laptops, our servers, switches, Wi-Fi, mobile devices, which are still benefited and utilized on the OT side. But when you really get into the nitty gritty, you're looking at PLCs, RTUs, sensors, industrial Ethernet. So all those things kind of have their own purpose in the environment of if you're talking an electric utility or, for example, a water plant. The protocols are also different. On OT, we have Modbus, DNP3, and a couple others, where on the IT side, we have our more typical like TCP, HTTP, HTTPS, the things that we're kind of familiar with and we've at least heard in passing if we don't know what they do. I like to say, even though you work in IT, you also may have never come across OT, even though they're very closely involved. They just don't get talked about synonymously. So we have a lot going on with that. Moving on to slide. Yes. Okay. So this one, we're going over the life cycle, which is what I had brought up a little bit earlier. The life cycle is significantly different in IT and OT environments. So in IT, you probably have like a service department. Service dependent. It might be like, for example, when I was working in help desk, we were Monday through Friday. So on the weekends, you were kind of whatever, if anything happened, our admins and stuff, it was kind of the same way. You'd hop on, but not too urgent. OT is up 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, constantly. And the life cycle of those environments vary. IT typically gets kept a little bit more up to date. You're looking at like a 3 to 5 year life cycle. In recent years, that might even start to shrink, but in OT, it's not really budging. You're staying at like a 10 to 30 year life cycle. And it's just based on the equipment that's involved, the software that is involved with that equipment, and then updates. I mean, even in common day, like our phones will get updates once every couple months, have to do a reset on our PC or something, daily or weekly. Sometimes patches go out in the IT world. Pretty common. Updates in OT, maybe yearly, sometimes never. Some places don't want to take the risk. They'd rather risk still being vulnerable to XYZ than risk the side effect of doing an update that might take them down, just because of I don't want to say how fragile the systems are, but because of how old they are in some cases, it's better to just keep it rolling and try and counter any vulnerabilities you have with patchwork around it rather than taking down that initial system to be able to execute something. So those are things you really have to focus on when you're doing OT, just because of the involvement. Taking a certain plant down might lose a company X amount of money, but that equipment also might just be damaged by not being constantly up and going. So there's a lot of variables with it compared to the IT side.
Hey, thank you, Jamie. So we're going to turn our focus now to the OT side of the house and talk about what we can do to secure OT systems. The SANS Institute for Cybersecurity has developed 5 critical controls for OT cybersecurity. So I like this 5 critical ICS controls presentation from SANS because it's 5 things, and I can remember 5 things. So if you can do these things, you can move your security footprint and risk exposure significantly to the more secure from less secure, just by doing a handful of things. There's more things to do, but if you can only do a few things, these are the things to pay attention to in your operational technology networks. And we're going to go through each of the 5 on the next few slides. When these slides, I think the slide decks will be made available. There's links in here to the SANS links. There's a video on more details about the 5 controls, as well as Dragos has a link, which we're summarizing some of the content from on the framework.
And this is where we come in with the OT and the ICS are so important, because when we are talking about the microgrids, power plants, water and wastewater facilities, you might not know it, but you have OT. Working at Dragos, a program that I run, I work with a lot of the under-resourced and underfunded municipalities, and we see it a lot where these people come in and they have an idea of what they might need, and they just don't have it. And so it's really important to recognize that even if you don't think your environment has any OT, or, oh, we don't have any of that, so we don't need it, you definitely need it. Your IT will not cover a lot of this stuff. It's good to think about both. I was talking with one of my coworkers earlier today. ICS specific incident response plans are super important. They were running a tabletop with an individual, company that I will not name, and they were like, no, we have our IT side. We're fine. And so they were running through that, and they thought that they could just go without internet access. They were like, okay, we shut this part down, no access to internet, we stop it. The malware, we're able to isolate and distribute. And some of the guys on the OT side that work with this equipment were like, hey, no, we actually have to be able to communicate with the internet, non-negotiable. There's certain things we have to send out that we can't not do. And so they went from, oh, cool, no, we totally passed this, we cut this off, isolate, mitigate, to, oh, we actually can't do that, and now we lost everything to this malware. Now, that was a tabletop, but tabletops are based off things that can actually happen, so you have to consider, what if that actually happened? You're relying on a response plan that is essentially designed for not the same systems. Just because their technology does not mean they're interchangeable like that. Now, I know ICS is going to be industrial control systems, but OT and ICS, I don't want to say they're interchangeable, but they're very, very close. So when you're thinking of these industrial control systems, think industrial, like heavy, big, important, right? And so it's very important to develop a comprehensive incident response plan that is specifically designed for those environments. OT, IT, ICS, you're all think technology is secured in the same way, cybersecurity. They have different equipment, they have different standards, they have different steps that need to be followed because they're just handled in different ways. As we went over, they have different protocols. They have different ways that they communicate with the internet. They have different ways that they get updates. They're on different machinery in regards to just the technology. Like, we're talking about stuff that's maybe from 20 years ago to stuff that's from the last 5 years. You have to have different plans for all those different systems. So it's super important to make sure that your plan encompasses procedures for the detection, reaction, and recovery of cyber incidents that are specific to your industrial control systems and not applicable from your IT, and you just try and slap it over your industrial control system incident response plan. The key elements are going to be, the plan needs to be clear, roles and responsibilities, all of that needs to be properly communicated, and communication protocols are super important. If you're like, oh, we'll just go to this guy, what if that person is out? What if that person is no longer with the company and you haven't updated your plan in 10 years? So now you don't know who to go to next. Time is super valuable. Time is money in a lot of these instances, and time is sometimes not losing the business as well. So it's super important to make sure that you set up clear roles, responsibilities, and plans for all those.
Okay. The second control to implement is something called a defensible architecture. And this is speaking about a network architecture. So you want to construct a network architecture that effectively segments and isolates critical systems so that everything's not all in the same network, kind of not keeping all your eggs in the same basket. The goal is to minimize the attack surface and reduce potential impacts of cyber incidents. So this would involve implementing what's called network segmentation, or using subnets and VLANs to separate systems across your OT network So to only allow the things that need to talk to each other access, and then isolate other things from that don't need that connectivity from other systems. To enforce strict access controls, so that can be done through firewall rules to bridge connections between network segments, and to utilize demilitarized zones for shared resources in your network that might have more exposure, but to keep the things in DMZ from getting a closer access to your more sensitive systems. And this is also known as a defense in depth. So you have multiple layers, multiple different layers of security protocols. So you put a lot of effort into protecting the things that you really care about, and you can have relaxed security and more accessibility to less vulnerable systems. And to separate your industrial, this is a really important thing actually, keep your industrial networks, your OT systems and your ICS systems separate from your corporate network, which is your IT network. So you don't want to have, your office network with your printers and your file shares and your laptop computers that you're accessing your email that have access to the internet on the same network as your industrial control and OT systems. That would be a bad idea. So we would definitely want to separate those two, and just separating those two constitutes network segmentation in and of itself. But you probably also want to think further about separating and controlling that. And then there's a new thing I'll mention here. It's not, I haven't listed here in the slide, but it's called Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA for short. And that is a difficult thing to do in OT systems that have very low latency for communications, for say controlling an engine throttle or something like that. But I think that there's research being done on that front, and that's something that people are interested in, is figuring out how to apply those zero trust network architectures. I won't go into great detail about that in this presentation, but that's something we might follow up on at another time. Okay, next on network visibility and monitoring. You can't protect what you don't know you have. So you have to have some visibility into the systems that are talking on your networks. And you can achieve this through continuous monitoring of your ICS networks to promptly detect anomalies and potential threats. So you would want to deploy specialized monitoring tools for network monitoring. You might send the network traffic to a security operations center, or what's called a SOC, a SOC, to analyze that data, and then they would detect anomalies and let you know. Otherwise, doing that internally is it's a very specialized skill set, and most utilities probably don't have the resources to have someone hired just for that. If you do have the staffing ability to do that, that's fantastic. To do it all internal, but a lot of times this would be outsourced. In addition to that, you might also have what's called a security information and event monitoring system, or a SIEM, that also keeps track of anomalies and information kind of in a dashboard view that you can see. So if you're familiar with OT systems, you might be familiar with human machine interfaces, or HMIs, where you can see the status dashboard of all the things operating inside your power plant. This is a similar type capability where you can see the security footprint and have a dashboard view of that. But you want to have some visibility and alerting, so when things happen, they can be detected and you can be notified about it. On secure remote access, this is a very important thing to have for your ICS environments, especially because in Alaska, a lot of our expertise to manage these systems are done remotely. So we have to have remote access for people to get in, but we want to minimize that access to a key system, sometimes called a bastion system or a jump host. And there's many different technologies that can be used to provide secure encrypted remote access to bridge the networks. Virtual private networks is one example, or a VPN for short. There's other ways to provide secure tunnels between networks. But however it's done, you want to make sure that it's done and managed and monitored. And you want to also use other factors here to protect it. So in addition to having a secure encrypted network tunnel for remote access, you want to utilize things like multi-factor authentication, so that it's not just the network that gets access, but somebody actually has to prove who they are to get in, and you're using multi-factor MFA authentication for that. And then, as I mentioned, encrypted communications and strict access controls to make sure that people aren't getting in. And if you see people attempting to get in that aren't supposed to, you want to get notified of that.
Risk-based vulnerability management program. This is something super important to have. As John had mentioned before, the SANS five critical controls are a really good framework because it's 5 steps. That's basically what we're highlighting. It's like these are 5 things that if you were just now hearing about OT and you're also going, wait, they're talking about exactly what I'm working with. Do we have something that's covering that? These are pretty much what you want to go to first and check the boxes. So having a risk-based vulnerability management program, pardon me, is super valuable because you need to understand what's going on inside your house, right? You know, if you have a couch, you know how many couches you have in your home. You might not know exactly how many plates you have, but you have a pretty good idea of what you own. You want to have that same idea and a little bit more. In this case, you want to know how many plates you have. So it's super important to conduct systemic vulnerability assessments and prioritize remediation based on impact. So going, okay, we have these 5 things. Which one is a bigger risk to us? And then you go down from there. If something poses a potential immediate threat, you take that one at the top of the list. If you have something that's like, oh, we're behind on a patch, but there's nothing that we've seen that's it's being used in a nefarious way. There's nothing reported for threat actors. Now, keep in mind, 0 days always exist, but it's important to prioritize that thing that we know can be used to harm you right away than something that hasn't popped up yet. So making sure you go through that and just evaluate the potential impacts on your critical systems and then executing a plan to solve those. The key elements here would be identify, assess, and mitigate within the ICS components. You're focusing on those that pose the greatest risk to your organization. Understanding your crown jewels is also super valuable in this case because you might look at something and go, that doesn't sound that bad, but it's correlating to something that is super valuable to you. So having that broad understanding of what you have going on in your house makes you recognize what you actually need to do step by step and figure out how you want to execute it. Because for one environment, something completely different might be what they prioritize first than what you should. And just because they did it, you go, oh, well, we're also water, we're also electric, we should do that. You really need to look at what is important to you and what those key components are to determine that program. And that's why it's important to do a self evaluation or run tabletops for your specific environment. Having the critical controls and a framework to kind of work around is super valuable, but breaking down your own environment to figure out what is most beneficial for you compared to looking at, you know, what other people are doing in environments that might not match you because we're all very unique in that way in what we have going on. So,
okay. All right, our last slide. So we've got electric power grids, we've got centralized power grids in the state, we've got microgrids in the state, and we have IT and OT cybersecurity. So there's a kind of a Venn diagram here of what is microgrid cybersecurity versus mainstream security. But we need both IT and OT security in our energy utilities, right? We have a business office side, we need the IT security, we have our industrial control systems, we need the OT security. Jamie, would you care to add anything?
no, I think it's super valuable. It's super important to understand. It's not a IT versus OT in a way of like, oh, one you need to be focusing on more than the other. It's IT and OT for your utility. And I think that's a really good thing to end off on is that they are both their collective, both are super valuable, but understanding that you might have IT down packed, but OT can also take you down like that if you don't have an understanding of what's going on in there and what can go on in there. Some people don't understand someone can go in and change the temperatures on in manufacturing plants if something is working with plastic or any material that's getting melted. With electric, they can go in and just change things inside of your equipment that can cause physical harm. And so understanding that your IT is not going to cover that and making sure that you're providing value and attention to both equally instead of choosing one or the other to prioritize.
Yep. And I would just add that the things that you would do to protect an IT environment, if you do those for OT, you might not be adding much security, and you really need to be risk specific to the environment that you're securing, and do the things that are going to get you the most bang for the buck in the OT that actually adds security and reduces risk, and do the right things for the IT environment as well. Okay. Well, that is the end of our presentation. We can take questions if anybody has any.
Well, thank you, Jamie and John. Really broke it down for us really clearly, and we understand the 5 steps now. Um, I'll remind everyone that you can put your questions in the chat and I can read them off for you. While people are doing that, you mentioned tabletop exercises. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those exercises typically run? And is this something that utilities could be running for themselves?
Yes. So actually, the company that I work at, Dragos, has a program called OT Cert, which is free to any asset owner and operator. So most electric facilities would typically qualify, and they have pre-made out tabletops that you can execute for yourself based on the industry you're in. I'm sure other companies, and I'm sure there's information out there that you can get that's also free and available to run tabletops, and it would be specific, for example, the electric sector, and it would go in what you need to do. What's your chain of command? Like, who are you going to next? If that person's not there, what's your next step? Does that stop you? And you go see how far you can get through, and you see what steps you're having a hard stop at. If you have maybe like a 10-step tabletop, for just a very, very loose example, and you can't even get past step 2 because you either don't have plans in place or you don't even know who you would talk to, you don't know what next steps would be, that's something to learn off of. So anyone can pretty much run one. The example I like to use, which is kind of loose and maybe off by a couple generations, but Dungeons and Dragons. That game is super fun, but it's kind of like a role play situation. You got to be able to get yourself in the headspace. You have to be able to sit there and go, okay, this theoretical that we have malware infecting our systems, and it's trying to hit XYZ. What do we do? You really need to be able to take that seriously. You need to be able to go, okay, if this was really happening, who am I reaching out to? How seriously are we taking this? What risks are we taking? If this was actually happening, this could be the fact that, like, we have to go down for X amount of time. How is that going to impact the company? The example that I had said, my coworker was telling me about one, that malware, because that one step that they had overlooked, where they thought that they could just disconnect from the internet, but they couldn't, not having a backup for that in the scenario of the tabletop would have caused them to fully go down, potentially irrecoverable. So when you put it into that example, you really have to be able to take them seriously, but there are a lot of resources out there to be able to do it yourself. You can go to a company, hire one out, for example, like us, to have them do that. But there's also free resources available to be able to go, okay, we have this here, let's follow the steps, see where we go. And if it's going pretty bad for you and you go, okay, maybe we need we need somebody to come in to tell us what we need to fix, that's good. That's progress, because now you're doing something and you're taking steps to fix it, rather than going, oh, that scenario we pushed up for a couple months actually is happening and we don't know what to do. And that can go so many places from there. So
Anything that you'd want to add, John?
No, thank you, Jamie. I think you know a lot more about tabletop exercises than I do. So that was excellent. Thanks for stepping in.
thank you.
I always thought it sounded like D&D, but I'm glad to hear it verified by a real professional.
That's what I always think of whenever we're talking about it. I'm like, all right, we're sitting here rolling some dice. What are we going to do next? There's no dice involved, but that's just always what I think about. But that's like the headspace you have to get in. It's still really cool. But yeah, you have to be able to go, okay, this scenario exists, but it exists, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting that you kind of have to switch your mindset and say, "Oh, if I can't do something, that's a success because we've proven where we have room for improvement." And many people don't want to discover things they're not good at, right? They want to discover that, oh, we're doing great. So I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on that mindset shift that owner operators need to get into of, hey, we're going to run through this exercise to discover what we don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like a lot of people are just afraid of being wrong. People are afraid of maybe being embarrassed in front of their coworkers or looking like they don't understand their environment, when in reality, technology is kind of wacky. There are a lot of things that can go on, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. The difference is that there are some places that will go, oh, we're just some small electric place out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants anything to do with us. But in reality, the landscape of technology right now, you might have some teenager across the world who's just trying to mess around, kitty scripter, as we would call them, with AI. They hop on ChatGPT, they go, oh, let me do this. There's a lot of reason that you would be targeted or something that would come your way that's not necessarily because you have a lot of money and you're easy to ransomware. Some people just want to be nefarious. Bad actors have the name bad actor for a reason. They are acting bad because they like it. But there are some people who are able to just disconnect themselves and they're doing this as like a little experiment, maybe a homework assignment across the world, see what they can do, see what they can get into. And it's good to practice because you're taking more steps than the person who's saying, no, that's not going to happen to us. We're too small. We're just this. We're just that. You're going, okay, let's see. Oh, we only got to this point. Okay. What do we need to fix? And then we'll try it again. Because anything can happen. I don't want to say you're going to be perfect. Like you can have a successful tabletop and then something comes up real world that's different than what you practiced and not something you thought was even a risk in your environment. But the fact that you've conducted those practices, you know the kind of steps, you're more confident if a situation like that arises. You're better off than somebody who's never done it before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Northwest Alaska is experiencing that right now, right, John?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, I only have one quick thing to add is just that running a cybersecurity program for any organization is all hands on deck activity. It involves every person in the organization. So everybody's relevant, and that it's really important to have support for the value of that cybersecurity program and the importance of cybersecurity from the top. Your administration needs to support it and understand its importance to the organization. So I think tabletop exercises are a great way to bring that collaborative visibility. Okay, I'll turn it back to Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And I had a question for you. I know that you're working on developing a cyber range for student interns at Alaska Center for Energy and Power to test on this summer. And I'm curious, how will you apply these SANS principles that we just saw to the cyber range that you're developing? And if you can maybe explain it to people a little bit.
So the cyber range that we're building at ACEP for this summer is for a red team, blue team challenge. So we're going to be teaching our interns how to defend and attack networks. So we're starting from some basic skills. So this is kind of preliminary to building, say, an ICS network that we would want to have to defend against. So it's kind of a preliminary step, I guess I would say. But I think we can apply many aspects of that ICS 5 control framework, even though it's more of an IT network than an OT network, to it. What I would say, one of the things we will be doing is a defensible architecture. So we'll be showing how to create firewall, how to use a firewall to protect and segment networks from other things and protect them. So there's definitely some applicability to that, but it's a little more basic skills.
Yeah, but like Jamie's saying, we've got to start where we are and move forward. So that's great to hear. Yep. We do have a question that's just come in from Arena, and I'll read it to you guys. This is a simple question, but I want to get your thoughts. The cybersecurity field is still rather new, and so I've noticed that a lot of professionals in the field have a varied background of experience and education. What would you say are some specific skills and requirements as a baseline for someone starting out in the field? And we need all the people to start out in this field we can, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
John, anything specific?
Yeah, I think so. I think having an understanding of basic technology, IT technology, and how do network protocols work and how do networks work. So understanding IP networks is really an important skill to have. You don't have to be a network architect or engineer to do this. It doesn't have to be to that level, but you should understand how to set up a Wi-Fi hotspot, for example, and how a router works. Things like that at that level, like a home network. That would be a very good skill for someone to have. And then I think you should also understand, how to install a basic operating system and keep it patched and updated, how to install software, how does that work? Understand basics of computing, CPUs, RAM, hard disks, storage devices, things like that. So there's basic IT skills involved with that. And so I think that's where I would start for somebody early career or young who's trying to get into this. That's a great places to start. There's these great little devices called Raspberry Pis that cover a huge amount of that. They're not terribly expensive and they're accessible and they focus on education of technology. And they're a great place to get started on all those aspects. So I think that's my quick answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the pointing out that a lot of the professionals have varied backgrounds is super valuable. Some of the events I've gone to, a lot of the older individuals that have been in this field for a long time, they, because cybersecurity is so new, as you had said, they came from just being at the company for a lot of years and the company trusting them and transitioning them from like their head of HR role or like their head of maybe a non-tech focused area of the company and transition them. They learned on their feet. I just graduated with my IT management and cybersecurity bachelor's, and the IT side and the cybersecurity understanding and my history with just building computers and working with it, moving to OT and ICS specifically, there's so much I'm learning. A lot of the hardware is very different. A lot of the software is different. The protocols are different. So my networking background was very weak, and I feel like that's where I see myself getting caught up a lot in trying to learn these new things. So as John said, I think having a good understanding of networking and just how hardware and machinery works in general is super valuable. Like I had mentioned earlier, make sure that you don't hop on public Wi-Fi and sign into important things. Understanding why not to do that is super valuable. Some people I've talked with, not necessarily in the industry, but family and friends, they go, "What? Really?" And I go, that we should be that should be approaching kind of general knowledge rather than like cybersecurity industry specific. So making sure like you can know that's bad, but taking a step further and knowing the reason why it's bad and looking into those things a little bit more, I think is super valuable. The education aspect, certain companies do really care about education, but I feel like it comes to that experience. Like if you have some hands-on experience, like working with some computers or doing some networking, that's very valuable, and it's very easy to transition to different roles with that rather than just like, oh, I studied this, but I have no applicable. That like physical hands-on experience, I feel is super valuable.
Well, that's great. And thank you, Arena, for that great question. Well, Jamie and John, thank you. We really appreciate you breaking this down for us and sharing your expertise and perspective.
So much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so now we will move on to a presentation by Jess Smith. So during the presentation, just like the last one, please continue to put your questions in the chat box. And we'll be getting them into the Q&A panel, just like what just happened. So Dr. Smith is a senior cybersecurity research scientist with experience working both across government and industry at PNNL. Jess's research focuses on industrial control systems, which you heard a little bit about just now, and cyber supply chain risk management. She has led research projects in everything from exploring state machine reverse engineering to defining resiliency mathematically in cyber systems. She's currently leading PNNL's supply chain integrity efforts, which support multiple government agencies. Prior to PNNL, Jess worked in industry at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, Inc., MITRE Corporation, and she interned at NASA. After completing both an MS and BS in computer engineering at the University of Idaho, Jess earned her PhD in computer science from Washington State University. She has her CISSP and CSSLP certifications and is a member of IEEE. So take it away, Jess.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'll steal the screen from you. Is that one coming through for you?
Looks great, and I love that green and blue, orange and blue color.
Yeah, they gave us a new slide deck, new background that we're supposed to be using because the PNNL is now 60 years old. And I will admit it's interesting to look back at some of our history, thinking that all of the changes that have come through in the past 60 years. So, but that would take me down a completely different rabbit hole. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine's cyber-induced power outages. I'm going to start off with some caveats. So, to start this, first of all, I've listed sources. If you're interested in more sources, all of these slides are available. I've got this pretty heavily referenced. You will find that this is only 2015, 2016, and this is only the technical for a couple of reasons. The first thing is I have a severe allergy to anything political. So I'm not going to be commenting on any of the more modern things just because that really does get into that Okay, where's the line between the political and the technical? So a little bit of a worry there. Any of the graphics in this, I know that there are some concerns with that. Graphics were from time of event, so keep that in mind. The 2015, 2016, as much as I can, I will be relying on those actual resources. However, some data doesn't exist. It wasn't released. We don't have it. We weren't able to collect it. The network was not set up to enable that kind of collection. So there's a little bit of extrapolation in here, and I will do my best to call that out any place where it's extrapolation and not fact. And then there is also some analysis. And just as we walk through this, there's always that, okay, well, what could we have done to fix it? I'm thrilled that I got to come after the last presenters because a lot of this stuff that they were talking about with, okay, well, what could we have done? If we're going through a tabletop exercise, well, what could we walk through? This analysis is the type of thing that allows us to go back and do lessons learned if something's already happened, or some predictive tabletops there to help figure out how to fix things. So hopefully you'll see some nice ties there. If you do have questions, please holler. I'd love to hear it as we go through too. So, like I said, sources are available if you want more on this. We've got a couple of papers we've published to walk through. This is it's an interesting case, and it is still in a lot of ways extremely relevant. So let's get into a quick overview here. So the Ukraine 2015 event happened on December 23rd, 2015, and it affected about 250,000 users across the country. Saw about 3 to 6 hours of downtime. And 3 to 6 hours is not major. It's not hopefully going to be death, except for in cases of like hospitals or other critical infrastructures. But it is December. And there's still a lot of folks in Ukraine who have the backup heating systems, similar to Alaska. There's okay, the power goes out. I still got to heat my home. I got to have a wood burning stove. I got to have a kerosene heater. I've got to have something. So we didn't see significant effect there, but 3 to 6 hours was pretty significant. And there was a significant amount of load dumped. So behind this though, so we've got this event. What was interesting about it was that this was the first intentional power outage from a cyber attack. We had seen power outages from cyber events before, but usually it was random virus gets into a network, causes problems. It was not targeted at electric power. It was not target. It's a virus that got everywhere. Or occasionally, we actually saw this with a nuclear power generation station a while back, was that an update, a patch was pushed, and that patch managed to break some significant things. Luckily, the nuclear power station was actually down for maintenance at that time, so we didn't see a negative impact there. But in this case, this was that first intentional power outage from a cyber attack. When you think about what was affected here, it was the distribution network, and we were looking at 3 Oblenergos: Chernivtsi, Kyiv, and Pritikarpatia. Chernivtsi and Pritikarpatia are the 2 on the left-hand side there, and then obviously Kyiv right there in the center. Interesting thing to note here is 6 Oblenergos, 6 energy companies were attacked or were infected, but only 3 were attacked. There's some, getting into that politics allergy, there's some reasoning behind that based on location, probably. But it was an interesting thing at that point, at 2015, we didn't know the future. We didn't know what was going to come. So it was, okay, this is interesting. This is data. So yeah, Chernivtsi is green, Pritikarpatia the blue, and obviously Kyiv is the green with the yellow dot, if you're following along. Occasionally, if you're reading other articles or other information on this, you might see Pritikarpatia is often also called Ivano-Frankivsk. So a little bit of naming, local name, international name, that type of thing. One of the interesting things here, though, was that it was based on phishing. And I know we heard this in the last talk as well, but the initial entry was that enterprise network and phishing. We were talking about IT and OT being these really kind of unique, different things, and they are. Your IT network, you're talking about IPsec, you're talking about being able to use traditional intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, your monitoring systems. You can have antivirus on all of your boxes. On the OT system, we're getting there. We're actually getting there. It's funny, when I came into this world, there were several generations of relays that didn't even have MMUs, memory management units. So putting an operating system on them wasn't going to happen. Putting antivirus on them that was a pipe dream. So we've come a long way. So we've got to the point where some of our OT systems can run some more of that automated security, but it's still not there. We're looking at OT systems, especially. They may be in operation for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I've seen gone and done site surveys for substations where they have the old mechanical relays still in place. They work. Why are we going to change it? There's no point there. So when we're looking at this enterprise network, they got in. Phishing was the actual entry point, but then they used Black Energy 3, which is a piece of malware, to escalate, to move into the OT network because they were connected. And this is something I see a lot because it's functional. When we need to remotely access, say, maybe a dam, a generations plant that is somewhere physically distant, it is much easier to just remote into that system. You can check on things, you can manage it, you can monitor it. That is awesome. It was funny. I was talking to some folks who were running a power grid, mostly transmission, out in Wyoming. And their comment was, power always goes out in the middle of winter in a howling blizzard, and it takes us 8 hours to roll a truck on a good day. So can we handle things being down? The default answer is, oh, take it off the network. Don't be on the internet. Well, are you going to leave somebody without power for 8 to 24 to 36 hours while you just roll a truck out there? It's not working. So we've got this enterprise network connected to the OT network for functionality to enable things. However, in this case, the attackers took advantage of that. They got into that enterprise network via phishing. They leveraged Black Energy 3 to escalate, and they got the admin credentials for the OT system. Once they had those admin credentials, they got VPN access into the OT. They just had free reign. It was actually kind of scary to watch and see how this perpetuated because, for example, the two graphics that I've got on the right-hand side here, these are actual screenshots of the malware that was used. Osinka, the top one in the back there, that translates roughly to Datatalk, bottom one. I start at the bottom here because that's a little more easier. Whoops, that's what I get for clicking. Datatalk translates roughly to amendment. Osinka is roughly assessment or evaluation. So two very good names. I see those come across my desktop all the time. Hey, we've got an amendment, we've got something going on, and we've got some kind of assessment that's going on, whether that's an audit, whether that's internal, whatever that is. Yeah, I would have opened it. And in the Osinka one in the back there, the phrase at the top translates roughly to something like estimation of the structure generating capacities and needs and optimization. So again, something that sounds very, very much legit. And the other thing to note is that the emails what these came in from, the sender address very much looked like it was coming from the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. So you've got what looks like a high-level authorized entity sending emails, sending attachments that look legit. And it was these macros that then allowed somebody to get in. Black Energy 3 leverages that to get into the network. So it was interesting when we actually got a hold of these emails, a hold of these screenshots, because they were believable. They really were. So that primary attack, keeping rolling here. Breakers for dozens of substations were tripped manually. And I think there's actually a couple of videos out on the internet now that I don't have a link to them. I don't have a source. But it was interesting because you had a gentleman, one of the operators of the control center there, who had his cell phone out and was videoing. He takes this, you can see him, he takes the camera and he's showing the screen. And there's a mouse moving around on the screen, clicking on things, tripping breakers. And then he pans the camera down. It was almost cinematic to look at his mouse, and nope, the mouse is not moving. Mouse is just sitting there. He's come back up to the screen, and yep, so it was fully a manual remote attack, which is really interesting. Most of the time, these type of attacks are automated. They're not going to leverage somebody else at a different location, remoting into your computer and manipulating the mouse. So it was a really interesting thing to see from a cybersecurity perspective. Now, power, like I said, off for about 250,000 users, and it did require manual mode. They had to run out 2 substations to get things back on to reset their status. So that was the primary attack. The fun thing from a cybersecurity perspective, and fun not certainly not for the operators in Kyiv, was that that was not all of it. That power outage was obviously the primary target. There was a secondary attack, though, that they were running at the same time. They were doing things like any computer they could get to. They were leveraging a module in Black Energy 3 to wipe the hard drives. Their universal power system, power supply, yeah, UPS. Their UPS was Ethernet enabled, so they turned that off. They were doing a phone denial of service. They had robocalls targeting those power centers, those call centers, just left, right, and center. So if you got somebody normal trying to call in and say, hey, my power's out, they're not going to get through. The robocalls just totally swamped it. And it actually, the way that their switchboard was set up, it effectively disabled both internal and external communications. Anything coming in or out of that control center was effectively shut down because of those robocalls. And then the final one here was they had a couple of network devices that they were able to access and then upload bad firmware to. An IED in this case is intelligent electronic device. It is not improvised explosive device. This hopefully doesn't go boom. This was actually a Moxa device that they were able to access and, like I said, upload the bad firmware. And at that point, those little devices were bricked. And for terminology there, when you brick a device, you turn it into a brick. You take what was a very nice computer, laptop, relay, PLC, and you kill it to the point where it is of no more use than a brick. You should go use it to prop open the door because that's all it's good for. And that was what they did in this case. They were able to get in there. Most of our cyber attacks, you can usually recover from it. You can shut the thing down, you can wipe the hard drive, you can reinstall, you can go back and pull out from base install. Maybe you're going to have to reset up your configs, you're going to have to work with your integrator to get things back up and running, but there's hope. In this case, that bad firmware, because there was no check on it being updated, totally bricked that device. So why were they doing this? And the best guess, and this is again that analysis and assumption and extrapolation, was confusion. They wanted to delay recovery. If all of this hadn't happened, our best guess is that the downtime would have been closer to 60 minutes. It still would have taken time to run out 2 substations. It still would have taken time to manually override things. But that 3 to 6 hours was because they hit everything they could find that was connected to the network. And it's a really interesting perspective when we come into this attack. And we'll compare this one to the 2016 attack here in just a minute. And that'll give you a little bit more perspective. So let's go and talk about 1 year later, which was 2016. And I will say there were many of us who were making bets as to whether or not there would be a 2017 and a 2018. We were kind of thinking, okay, is this going to be an annual thing? But 1 year later, almost exactly a year later, on December 17th, we had another power outage attack. Now this one, there's actually less data available. It was held pretty close, and it targeted just Kyiv. They only saw that hour of downtime, and their target was only one transmission substation, the Pivnichi substation. And it's a step-down station out there, and it's the big question here was why? Why hit this one? Obviously, Kyiv being there, it's a good target. If you're going to hit something you want it to be felt, Kyiv is the major metropolitan center, major population centers. Okay, that makes sense from an adversary's point of view. But why this one? Because it was, in some ways, very similar impacts. Power's gone down. However, how they did it was something very different. First of all, they started the same way. Phishing works. Why change what works? If it's the phishing gets us in, and it's the phishing piece of this, I reiterate over and over and over again, because it still works. I put this slide deck together, I think in about early 2017. Yeah, early to summer of 2017. And their phishing in this case was interesting because it was getting better. And we saw at that point that phishing caused or was the entry point for something in the range of 98% of all cyber attacks, the ones that were successful. If they got through, it was very largely because they'd started with phishing. We're now, what, almost 10 years later, 10 years after this second event? Phishing still works. Phishing is still in the 90 percentile of how attackers are getting into our systems. And what's scaring me right now with phishing is it used to be with a phishing email, you could do your sanity checks. You could look at it and say, okay, does this have poor grammar, poor spelling? Is it coming from an email that it shouldn't? Is it, if you just dig into the links, where do the links send you? You could do a lot there. And it, especially the grammar and spelling thing, a lot of it was written by people who maybe weren't native English speakers. So it didn't flow to a native speaker's brain. It was like, hang on a second, something's weird here. Maybe it was minor, but we'd catch it. Enter generative AI, enter large language model AIs. And all of a sudden, the phishing that we're seeing come out is so much better. It is so much cleaner. It is so much more well crafted because the adversaries are taking advantage of this. This is a tool that they can use as well. They can upload a basic email and have the AI clean it up for them. So the phishing that we're seeing coming out right now really does scare me. And I'm highlighting it over and over again to pretty much everybody I talk to because I think we're going to see another uptick in phishing targeting critical infrastructure. So there's my phishing soapbox. But just to be aware, AI helps the adversaries as well. And phishing is one of those places we're seeing it. So in this case, though, UK in 2016, we saw better phishing. From a technical standpoint, it was interesting. Most phishing attempts, if you click that macro, most of the actual code behind the macro is there for the back door. So you can get into that code and look at it and go, this isn't right. In this particular case, 90% of the macro code was there for obfuscation. It was there to make it look believable. It was there to actually do some basic function that the Excel file was claiming to do. And in this case, again, the email was polished. It was believable. It was well written, proper grammar, proper spelling, all of the things that you would expect out of a good email. So again, why change what works? That's any adversary is going to look for that low-hanging fruit. So we saw single substations breakers tripped. Most of this was done through crash override. It's also known as InDestroyer. It's a piece of malware that's a very plug-in based modular piece of malware. What's interesting about crash override is that it actually has modules that target 61850. That was new. That was very interesting that it was targeting those protocols because up until now, almost all of our malware has targeted IP. They aren't touching Modbus. They aren't touching DNP. Those are just too unique. However, we're starting to see that. And we've seen that continue through some of the modules that we've seen in the event past, or the years past this event, is there are more modules that are out there that are targeting OT systems, that are enabling an attacker who has no understanding really of how an OT system is different. What is different? How would you craft a Modbus packet? They don't need to know that anymore. There are tools out there that will do it for them. So it's brought the barrier to entry down for those that are attacking OT. It used to be that OT was custom. OT was very unique. It was a very different environment. So most of the attackers were focusing on the IT stuff. That's where the money is. We're seeing some change there. The other really interesting thing about crash override is a lot of the time how we find that there is malware on our system is because the malware is talking to somebody. It's reaching back to some server somewhere to get instructions. In this case, crash override does not require direction from an outside source, so we don't see that communication. We call it command and control. You don't see that command and control messages back and forth. It really did require some advanced behavioral analysis to detect it. Concerns about this? And when I put this slide deck together, like I said, it was a few years ago, could be easily modified to DNP3. Has been modified to DMP3. Could be easily modified for many things, and that has been very true in the same way that we design software now to be modular, to be flexible. Well, the bad guys are designing malware to be modular and flexible. So it's always this arms race. If we make it a little better, a little bit harder, and they find a new way to attack us. There was a comment in the chat there about what should you look for in someone when you're looking for a cybersecurity professional. And all of the skills, yes, I fully agreed with the previous speaker on all of those. But you've also got somebody who wants to learn, who actually has a passion for this, because there is something new coming out every week, every day. Just keeping on top of it is hard. So let's do a quick comparison here. Looking at 2015. 2015 was COTS tools. It had to have had a lot of people to have literally had that many people there tripping breakers in that control substation or that control center. There had to have been a lot of people with their hands on mice. That's odd. And in some ways it was odd because it was a low tech level. 2016 was a very much higher tech level because it was automated, because it did not require many people. A more advanced attacker will write a script, will write malware, will write a code to do it, because a piece of code can go in and accomplish something, whether that's turning off the power or exfiltrating data or any of the other horrible things they can do. But they can do it very, very quickly if it's automated. It's faster than a human can respond most of the time. 2015, having that low tech level, it was slow. There was a lot of people involved. It was kind of this interesting same goal, but definitely an advancement in the tools and techniques that they were using. Automated gives us logic bombs. It gives us the ability to do concurrent attacks. It's so much more advanced. But both of them had the feel of capability testing of, okay, well, what happens when I take this down? How far can I get into the network? When we saw that there were 6 Oblanergos that were attacked, not just the 3, it was like, okay, what's the reasoning here? And then the phishing. Both of them had a phishing entry. Like I said, I think we're up to 98% of all successful reported attacks. The start was was a human. I make a joke that the only truly secure computer, the only truly secure system is one that we encase in concrete and drop in the bottom of the Mariana Trench so no human can touch it. Because if you've got humans in the system, humans make errors. Humans like to think the best of other humans, or at least I do. I might be a minority sometimes. But we like to think that USB stick that we found in the parking lot could have somebody's pictures on it, of their kids, of their grandparents, and we want to get it back to them. It takes work to think, hey, hang on a second, why is this sitting in the parking lot? Could somebody bad have done this? And we get used to thinking that somebody bad could have done this in the real world sometimes. Like when you walk down through a city street, you've got that mentality. We don't yet have that mentality a lot of the time for internet and digital based things. I'm seeing a lot more of our kids have some of that, the ones who have grown up with this, but it's a very different thing. So 2015, low tech, higher impact. 2016, very specifically targeted, but a higher technology level. So what were our lessons learned from this? Initial vector was phishing for both. We've talked about that a couple of times. Very good emails, very good macros. It's hard to defeat that. And to be blunt, you're never going to catch all of those. You can catch most of them. But at some point, somebody is going to click. Somebody is going to think, oh, shoot, this is actually the IRS. I have got to take care of this. They're going to repossess my house. It's going to happen. So how do we then build around it? How do we put in those possible defenses? The previous speakers brought up defense in depth, zero trust. Those are all different techniques and methods and ways of thinking about things. And they're all great ways to dig in and say, okay, well, how do I make this more secure? Don't put it on the internet or have a way to disconnect quickly. Yes, it's going to be on the internet. We're in a day and an age where that's going to happen. I think everything's on the internet. My nephews have got those little light up shoes that the kids walk and they flash. Those things have network access. You can get access to those and change the colors on the shoes now. So it's going to be on the internet. But having a way to disconnect quickly can sometimes be critical. Our OT systems, whether it's electric power, water, wastewater, any of like the chemical processing plants, they should have a way to disconnect quickly. They should be set up so that they can continue running in a safe state by themselves without any control from a higher level for at least 30 to 60 minutes, because that gives us time to deal with the problem in the IT network. That gives us a chance to fix things before it gets in there and actually has a physical impact. That for me is the big line between IT and OT. In IT, if IT goes down, we lose dollars. If OT goes down, we could lose lives. So let's take and put a line there and say, okay, let's design this so that it is resilient and secure, but let's make sure we have ways to separate it. And the second part of that is network segmentation. When we talk about defense in depth, it's okay, well, let's make sure there's multiple walls here. Let's figure out what is most valuable. And network segmentation is the key to doing that. In the 2015 attack, we saw them leverage the IT network, getting admin access, getting access to that VPN into, because they did have a VPN. They did have some network access, or excuse me, network segmentation. But because the adversary was able to get into the IT network, they got the admin controls. The admin controls allowed them to break that network segmentation, to jump that segmentation. The other big thing, especially now, is we're getting more and more advanced relays, PLCs, RTUs, our SCADA controllers. We can start leveraging host-based security as well as network-based. We need to design our networks so that there are firewalls and detection systems, but we can also start designing our actual systems as if they were a regular computer, which most of the time they are, and putting security on those endpoints as well. It's harder. One of our big challenges is it slows things down. It increases latency. There's a problem there. So that's for us at P&L, one of our major areas of research is how do we increase security without increasing latency as well. And then finally, multi-factor authentication. This is one of those things. Ease of use is often the primary goal for most operators. And just typing in a password is easy. We finally got people to the point where passwords are acceptable. Like I said, I started many years ago at a day and age when typing in a password was considered a pretty high barrier, a pretty high bar there. Getting folks to be willing to do that it took us a bit. We got to take that to the next step, though. Passwords in this day and age are not enough. The adversary can crack them. The adversary can get around that and take advantage of it. Multi-factor is where we say, okay, well, you've got something which is say your password, something you have, cell phone, or something you are, like a fingerprint reader or something, and having at least two different methods of those so that somebody can't pretend to be you. I love talking about multi-factor authentication, but we also then need to talk about just basic password security. I was doing a site visit for a control center at one point, and there was a gentleman there, and it was really interesting because I was trying to figure out what the heck was he doing, because he was moving between systems. He was doing something pretty advanced, and just every so often he'd sit back in his chair and he'd lean, and I'm like, okay, he's stretching his neck. Does he have back problems? What's going on here? And it caught my eye, and I finally figured it out. He had been told he wasn't allowed to put his passwords on a sticky note on the desk in front of him, or under the keyboard, or any of the other million and one places that we've found people putting their passwords. He hadn't been told not to put it on the ceiling. So that was what he was doing, was every so often he'd stretch back and look up at the ceiling where he had a piece of paper in big letters with all of his passwords typed and stuck up there on that ceiling. So he was getting his passwords. It's a lot of passwords is education and making sure our folks understand that we are doing our best to make this as functionable, as available, as workable as possible. But we do also have to have security as a goal in here, because if the adversary gets into our electric power, they can turn it off just the same as a snowstorm or an avalanche, or if you're down in the south, a hurricane or a tornado. Those can all take the power out, but so can an adversary. And security is a critical part of keeping the lights on. I have no idea where I am on time. So, Vanessa, how am I doing?
I think you're right about on time. If you have more to share, I think it's pretty riveting. So keep going, but I think you're right about at the mark.
All right, I think this was the last of slides. I could happily this is a passion for me, so I could happily get on my soapbox and talk for the next couple of hours. I think I'd probably bore you all to tears. But if you do have questions, I'm Jess Smith at pnnl.gov, jess.smith at pnnl.gov, or occasionally Jess at pnnl.gov. There are a few benefits to being a woman in technology. You get sometimes the good emails. Nobody else had Jess at pnnl. If you have a burning question about OT cybersecurity, grid is obviously my focus area, but I've also played in water, wastewater. Or if you've got a supply chain question, that's my other passion is let's take and look at this from the broader sphere. I've got to put this device in my system. Where did it come from? How can I evaluate the security of something that I'm getting? That type of thing. Another soapbox I'm happy to get up on. But thank you guys all for your attention today. And yeah, I'll open it up for questions.
Well, thank you for opening this window into your world. It's really interesting to see how you look at these and analyze these attacks and what you shared so far. I think we have some questions coming in. The first one is from John Haverlack, who presented just before. He said, "Thank you, Jess, for the excellent presentation. What similar vulnerabilities do you see between Alaska and Ukraine?" And
I'm
I
going
think
to,
probably related to energy sector. Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways. In 2015, 2016, I would have said that there was a lot of similarities because Ukraine at that point had a very disconnected grid. Yes, it was connected, but in a lot of ways it was really unique because the eastern half was more connected to Russia's power grid. The western half was much more tied into Europe's grid. There's a lot of little pockets in between them that were these funny cross connections. So the power grid was this unique, very unique critter. And I've seen the same type of thing up with the power grids that y'all set up in Alaska. Yes, there's connections. Yes, there's those critical sharing points. But there's always the assumption that this could go down and we need to stand alone. Very similar to the Ukraine grid as it was 2015, 2016. Over the past few years, in some ways that's increased. In some parts of Ukraine, they have gotten much more on the we have no idea what's going to happen. We've got to be able to stand up. Mostly on the eastern half for obvious reasons. The western half has moved on with their continual ties to the European power grid, so they're actually closer or less isolated in many ways. So it's kind of been an interesting split there in the country and just their shift between the Russian ties to the EU ties of their grid. The other thing I see is a whole bunch of folks who understand that sometimes the weather's going to do what it wants. Mother Nature's going to do what it wants. And you just have to deal with it. They're used to dealing with snow. They're used to dealing with some of the crazy weather. It's a interesting environment over there. And they act accordingly. They've got the backups. They don't expect things to always work. And I've seen a lot of that same independence of spirit and resiliency out of most of our Alaska partners up with the electric utilities and just with folks up in Alaska in general. And then the second question, I'm assuming Ukraine adapted to the attacks. Any info on that? Ukraine has been ongoing in their efforts to shore up their grid. No shame here, please. This is learning. Ukraine, we actually saw them come back after 2015 and try and wipe their systems, get clean, get things fixed. A lot of kudos to them for that. They didn't have necessarily the resources, more in the manpower that they needed to make that happen. And so that's part of why some of the things happened in 2016 was that they were not able to harden to remediate quickly enough. It takes time. It takes money. And getting money through the door is often a more challenge than getting the right people. So I know that they have been working on it. I know that they are currently transitioning. PNL actually runs a lot of different training programs, mostly focused on the nuclear sector. Can we go out to a country that has recently gained nuclear power? and work with them to make sure that their security is looking good, that they have good operators. I know historically we've done similar things for Ukraine. Obviously, right now, we don't send people to Ukraine. That's not safe for our staff. But there is ongoing support to them, as especially they're seeing a shift in their workforce. Obviously, a lot of their gentlemen are serving with the military, and so we're actually seeing a lot more of female control system operators coming through and getting trained up in how to go forward with this. So that's been kind of a fun thing from my perspective. Just that it's almost a different viewpoint that they've got, and there's a lot of okay, we're going to keep the lights on. It doesn't matter what's happening around us. We got to keep the lights on. That same spirit is there, which is it's been good to see that.
Cool. I had a question if we don't have any more from people coming in. Um, so I was curious about the changing nature and timeline of attacks. And so you talked about two phishing events that the way you told it, it sounded like they got access and then the attack happened. I'm curious if you're seeing a change in which there's access point that happens maybe through phishing, but later on there's an attack. And if there's any strategies you're aware of that Alaskan communities could use to detect the vulnerabilities prior to the attack, but after that moment of access has happened.
I will answer that again in two different ways. First of all, for the assistance with finding those things, find partners like Dragos, find partners like Red Trident. Those are the folks that really can get in there. There's not any one specific piece of advice because everybody's system is different. That is one of the funnest things about OT systems, is that everybody is setting it up for a different environment, a different electrical load, a different user base. And so everything's kind of unique. So it's hard to give broad advice. On the attackers, though, on the bad guys, we are seeing, especially with APT level, advanced persistent threat, state actor type level, folks who've got a lot of money behind them is really what it comes down to. Those folks, they will get into your system and they will wait. They're not getting in there to make money. If you're talking about a cyber criminal or a kid in their basement, they're script kiddies, usually those folks will trigger their attack and you'll see the response almost immediately because that's what they're going for. It's ransomware. They want money. It's a script kiddie. He's just fooling around, seeing if you can turn the lights out. They want those impacts immediately. However, critical infrastructure is a target of international, state sponsored or effectively state level sponsored folks. And so they'll get into a system and they'll wait because their goal is not to shut you off now. Their goal is to have the ability to shut you off when they want, when there is something else going on. And this is one of those things that really concerns me is what happens when something like, say, a hurricane happens and a cyber attack happens. We saw what was it? Metcalf was 2019? Metcalf substation in California. We saw an attacker who chose to shoot at the substation as well as cut comm lines. So we're seeing those things where okay, what happens when we have a major snowstorm? We have an avalanche. We have I don't know, a polar bear decides that there's something tasty inside of a substation and goes and gets themselves good and fried. Okay, we got a problem here. How do we deal with those on top of a cyber attack? How do we deal with those combined type of things? Because that's what I think those adversaries, they're getting in there. They've got a purpose. We just don't know what it is yet. We don't know when they're actually going to hit us. And that to me, in a lot of ways, is some of the scariest bit, is we're compromised and we don't even know it. So yes, talk to Dragos, talk to Red Trident, talk to your folks, Department of Energy, Cybersecurity, Energy Security and Emergency Response Office, CSER. Those folks are great. If you're in solar or wind, the CETO and WETO offices, there's a lot of resources out there. I know there's a lot of confusion, a lot of concern out there right now, but there's a lot of folks who we're in this because this is our passion. This is where we would truly believe to be, and we will find a way to get you the help you need. It might take some interesting paths, but we'll find a way.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you bring up a good point is that there's a lot of interconnected devices when you bring renewables into a microgrid. And so you do
Yes.
need more access to the internet, which means you also have increased vulnerability. Arena has another great question. I don't know how to ask this in a non-political way, but what do we need to consider are credible concerns for Alaskan systems if we engage in joint energy projects with the Russian Federation? And if this is making you break out in hives, we can move on.
No, it's one of those that we have to operate in the world. And the current political situation, I would say I think it comes back to the engineering mantra, trust but verify. At some point we have to trust. At some point we can't all just stand alone. We're not little mountains all of our own little person and don't need anybody else's help, whether that's a human needing a community or electric power needing to reach out and touch other electric power. We've got to move from generation to distribution somehow. And usually those two things are not in the same location. So we've got to find ways of working, whether that's y'all up in Alaska working across to Russia, or we're actually seeing this down on the southern border as well, of how do we tie more closely with the Mexican power grid? Is there a way forward that's beneficial to both sides for that kind of a scenario? And it always comes back to trust but verify. Go out and yep, we're gonna try this, but be doing your due diligence checks. Look into the companies when you get devices in. Look into the devices. Pop open the case and see what you see. It's having good relationships with your sponsors and your vendors to make sure that you're getting good information and good remediation from them. It's leveraging your network to make good decisions because every single one of those decisions is going to be a little different. So there's no way I can give you a playbook. But having a community, like I said, whether it's your Dragos type folks or it's your government type folks or it's your guide out down the street, it's the next community down, whatever community you're in, leverage those networks to be always trust but verify.
As you talk, I'm getting the mental image of each of these critical infrastructure or energy systems like a thumbprint, like a fingerprint, and that they really are different and unique. And so you need someone to come in and help you understand the specific situation that you're in. And that's also really helpful information that this isn't cookie cutter things.
No.
You really need to be specific when you're building your resilience and defense strategies.
Yes. And I would say that's more true for Alaska than almost any place else. There's a lot of places if you go Missouri, Kentucky, something like that, where they can afford to do cookie cutter.
Mm.
It's not possible in Alaska. There's too much uniqueness of environment, too much uniqueness of end user.
Well, we always think of ourselves as exceptional, but it's because you're invalidated.
Well, y'all are, and I love working because I actually got a chance to go up to Anchorage a couple years ago. This was pre-COVID. Oh boy. Somebody else said Metcalf was 2013. I'm getting old. I don't know what happened here, but getting a chance to go up to Anchorage and talk to folks up there, and it was the way that y'all treat resiliency, I think is really something that the lower 48 should be looking at. We should be exploring how you guys are doing things because in many ways you are more set up, more well prepared for a lot of what could come down the pipeline than many of us are. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from you guys.
Thank you for that. I'm curious if there's any other research or anything that we can look for that's coming out from you and PNNL related to cybersecurity as we continue to learn and inform Alaskans and Alaskan utility operators.
I know there is always a lot of we are always working on publishing things. We're always working on tool development. I'm trying to think of anything specific that I would highlight. One of the things to probably watch is the focus on, we call it cyber scrim, cyber supply chain risk management. And we are specifically focused on OT critical infrastructure. And it's that widening of the aperture. How do we look at a relay and say, where did this thing come from? Okay, it came from Schweitzer, from GE, from Siemens, from Rockwell, from whoever. Well, where did they get stuff from? Where are the chips on that board from? Is there a concern there? It's a broadening of that aperture because just dealing with what's today in front of us, there's so often we get stuck doing that. We're fighting the fires that are right here, right now. But if you can take 2 seconds to breathe and take a step back and look at that broader picture, look at where things come from, all the different places they're going to, how this all impacts in your system, A, it gives us the ability to be more efficient with how we plan for mitigations and resources to fix things. Because believe me, none of us have all the money we wish. I think being efficient with resources is ongoing for everybody. But if you're interested in going down that path, PNNL and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, we were working on a lot of this work, software bill of materials. If you're in that world at all, your software security, your software supply chain, hardware bill of materials, we were working in this, trying to find ways to make those things actually more useful. And we're struggling to find conferences to publish at. So we said, heck with this, we're going to start our own conference. And our first annual Cyber Scrim for OT systems was last fall. It was at PNNL in Washington State. Lawrence Livermore will be hosting it. We're going to swap back and forth. So if you want to get out of Alaska in November and come down to the Sunny Bay area, we will be holding that conference again. And again, it is specifically focused on our OT systems. How do we improve the resiliency, improve the security for all of those different OT systems? And PNNL is very much grid focused. So yes, we reach out to our friends in water, wastewater, mechanical processing, ag bio, all of those folks, but electric power is a lot of it.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jess. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today.
Anytime. And like I said, if you have questions later, burning questions about cybersecurity or supply chain risk management, feel free to shoot me an email.
Now we're ready to continue with our program, and please help me welcome Daniel Arnold from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where he serves as a research scientist and adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. So he graduated from UC Berkeley with a PhD in mechanical engineering in 2015, right about the time of one of these attacks we were looking at, and was an ITRI Rosenfield postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory from 2016 to 2017. His recent work focuses on the use of these techniques for the cybersecurity of the electrical power system and other critical infrastructure. Welcome, Dan. So take it away.
Okay. Thank you all for having me today. It's my pleasure to come and speak to you. I'm Dan. I'm a research scientist at LBNL and adjunct faculty at UC Berkeley. I teach a course on data science for energy systems, and my work is largely focused on the cybersecurity of the power grid. Today, I'll be talking about two projects we have at LBNL, which were part of the bipartisan infrastructure law a few years ago, which we call 40125, the 40125B program. These are projects that are run out of CSER's Risk Management Tools and Technologies program, and were awarded in the fall of 2023. Although our project didn't get started until early 2024 due to subcontracting challenges. But we're up and running, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about these two projects today. So a little bit about the cybersecurity work we do at LBNL. We've been supporting DOE's cybersecurity missions since around 2012. This was before CSER was even a thing. It was the cybersecurity research was largely being coordinated out of the Office of Electricity in the CEDS program. We used to work for that program. We've been really interested in the increasing complexity of the electrical grid due to the proliferation of distributed energy resources. The addition of these devices, solar systems, batteries, electric vehicles, other IoT type devices, makes the grid really difficult to manage and control, and presents very challenging research questions for us to try and tackle. We focus a lot on the role that the remote update capabilities of these devices, how that can influence the threat landscape. We'll talk about that in a minute or so. And we leverage a lot of tools from artificial intelligence and machine learning, both to understand how the grid is behaving in the presence of DER devices, which could be compromised as part of an attack, and also to learn mechanisms with which we can try and mitigate these attacks through perhaps controlling DER and adjusting their behavior to have some sort of real-time defense we can mount against different cyber threats. Our team competencies, we're at a very interesting intersection of disciplines here. We have expertise in control theory, convex optimization, artificial intelligence, machine learning, of course, power systems, computer security, and then differential privacy. I'll talk about two projects today which are ongoing, both of which began in January of 2024 that are part of the bipartisan infrastructure law 40125B. Project Magic is the project that I'm of which I serve on as the PI. We are using reinforcement learning for distribution grid cybersecurity. That's a $5 million effort sponsored by Risk Management Tools. And then I'm also the co-PI on a project, Shielders, which is leveraging data privacy techniques to mount what we're calling a collective defense framework for electric power distribution grids. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. It's another $5 million effort. We have a great group of partners, which spans folks in academia, industry, and the utility sector. We do a lot of work with NRECA. So we're very sensitive to the needs of the rural electric cooperatives. And a lot of the work that we do is actually tailored so that the rural co-ops can compete with some of the bigger utilities in terms of how they can take advantage of some of the latest cybersecurity solutions. We partner with a lot of fantastic researchers now at Cornell Tech, University of Central Florida, who are experts on artificial intelligence. We do a lot of work with Siemens for hardware demonstrations and partnerships with other labs, including NREL. And we have a great partnership with a startup company called Kivala, which will be featured in the Shielders project. And they're building a digital twin of the U.S. power grid, which we're leveraging as part of the collective defense framework we're trying to stand up in that project. So I'll first talk about Project Magic, which is the project that I'm running. MAGIC stands for Mitigation via Analytics for Grid Inverter Cybersecurity, sponsored by RMT. It's a build project, 3-year effort starting in January 2024. It's going to run to December 2026. LBNL is the team lead. Members on the team are NRECA, Cornell, Siemens, and NREL. Just under a $5 million budget. And the goal of the project is to develop and test secure artificial intelligence algorithms for DER operational cybersecurity. The objectives of the project we have 5 here. The first is to develop algorithms to detect cyber attacks on aggregations of DER and to distinguish these attacks from normal operating conditions. We are extending a reinforcement learning framework, which we built during previous RMT projects to mitigate the effect of cyber attacks on DER in a wide array of operating conditions. We are integrating these algorithms into a commercially available product. This is a Siemens microgrid controller for demonstration of the algorithms, and we're going to be doing that in the 3rd year of the project. We are creating an open source simulation tool in partnership with our friends at NRECA that allows electric utilities to determine rules to detect and mitigate attacks that are designed to disrupt normal grid operations or cause instabilities in their systems. And then our friends at NREL are helping us stand up a software test harness to assess the security of AI ML algorithms for different uses in the electric power sector. Bottom line, we are trying to give operators new tools to enhance the cyber resiliency of their systems. We're strongly motivated by the threats introduced by new technology associated with distributed energy resources, in particular the smart inverter, which converts DC quantities of power into AC quantities of power. So power produced by your solar panel or your battery can be exchanged with the AC grid. This device is right. This element of DER is ripe for cyber attacks. And there was an event that happened that was on the FBI's radar in Hawaii last summer, where there was a vulnerability discovered in these devices. This news article made its way around made its way around our ecosystem and was cause for concern. An excellent example of the potential that these devices the way in which these devices can be utilized to create problems in the electrical grid was illustrated also in Hawaii a few years ago. There's a lot of sun in Hawaii. They got a lot of solar out there. And so there was so much solar on the island. This was back in 2015. That the local Hawaiian electric utility worked with a vendor. This was Enphase, and they were able to roll out updates to 800,000 inverters in a single day on Oahu. That's 4/5 of all of the rooftop solar capacity on the island. And so this is a substantial enhancement of the cyber attack surface. And this was one of the events that first got us thinking about how do we practice cybersecurity, given that this is the way the grid is evolving. So on our project, the 5 members here, LBNL is the team leader, responsible for overall project performance, algorithm and software development. Siemens is our hardware in the loop demonstration partner. NRECA is giving us use cases, data, and is responsible for integrating what we're building into the open modeling framework, which is an open source simulation tool that they maintain. Cornell, we're leveraging their expertise for algorithm and software development to secure the algorithms that we're actually introducing to mitigate and detect attacks. And NREL is functioning as our red team on the project. The control philosophy we have in Project Magic is to think about all of the controllable resources in your system and divide them into 2 groups. One group could be compromised, and this could be due to perhaps the back-end system at Enphase or Tesla getting compromised, and then an attacker has access to a huge swath of individual devices, and they can update the control behavior on those assets. This also includes perhaps legacy assets like your voltage regulators or your LTCs. But if you think about all the DER, all the controllable devices, divide them up into 2 groups, the attackers can control one set of devices. We're coming up with approaches to control the remaining set of non-compromised devices. And through intelligent adjustments to their behavior, we're hoping to mitigate some of the effects of cyber attacks that could be introduced as part of updated system behavior on the compromised set of assets. An example of some of the things we're trying to be able to correct with the controllers that we're building is shown here. On the upper right is an example of an attack which a cyber attacker could launch through compromising legacy control devices like your LTCs, as well as different types of DER, solar behind the meter storage, and electric vehicles. They can create, they can do a lot of things, but one thing they can certainly do is create voltage imbalances in their system. And these types of imbalances in 3-phase systems could affect high precision manufacturing you have in your grid, or the operation of 3-phase motors. This level of imbalance, certain motors will could burn up or switch off, disconnect from the power grid to avoid disruption. And so the algorithms that we're building in Project Magic, again, control the remaining set of devices which have not been compromised during the cyber attack. And when the attacker launches their attack, we detect this voltage imbalance, we deploy our assets, and are able to mitigate that imbalance in real time, as shown in the bottom subplot there. The technical approach as far as algorithms that we're building in the project, the need that we saw in the previous efforts that we've been engaged with RMT was that a lot of distribution system utilities, especially the rural electric co-ops, do not have the computational power or resources to train advanced artificial intelligence algorithms on their systems and on their data. And so we were in a situation where we had to train one algorithm for specific networks. And if the utility had to reconfigure their network for whatever reason, just for normal maintenance, we had to retrain the algorithm again. That's not a solution that democratizes this technology for use amongst the co-ops at large. And so in Project Magic, we're working on what we're calling universal learning models that will essentially allow us to have one agent that's broadly applicable across a huge different set of distribution system topologies. So we're approaching a one agent, you train it once and deploy it everywhere type of scenario. And that's where we want to be. That's going to allow these different utilities to utilize this technology for active cyber defense and have it be valid if they have to reconfigure their grid, for instance. We're building explicit networks to detect attacks and mitigate attacks. We're trying to put the system operator at the center of any responses that we're going to affect. And so we're trying to give them better information about their system under attack in terms of which devices have been compromised, at what locations in the system, and what do we think the settings of the compromised assets have been set to, so the operators can make better decisions in terms of how they want to utilize our technology to mitigate the attacks. We are going to be hardware in the loop testing these algorithms in a Siemens microgrid controller, the CP8050, which is going to be done in the third year of the project in 2026. Siemens is putting together a test bed for us, which consists of emulators to represent different devices in the system, regulators, protection systems. We're going to have realistic communications simulated through, or not simulated, actually conducted through Modbus, TCP, and DNP3. And then we're using Helix and OpenDSS to simulate the presence of the electric power grid. And then we're going to be deploying our algorithms in the HIL testbed against use cases that NRECA put together for us. And that is going to help us determine if our algorithms are up to the task when if they were to be deployed in the field. Just a brief timeline of the project. This is a 3-year effort. We are just past the first year here in blue. We had a lot of work at the beginning of the project, specifying use cases, building a red team development framework, doing algorithm development. We're still doing some of that now. And now we're in a phase where we're actually building software. We're building the test environment, building the test plan. What's really great about the build projects is that at least the ones in our category all had a demonstration component. And so we're actually working on a test plan, which is going to require DOE approval before we transition to the demonstration phase in the third year of the project. That's going to be due right around Halloween this year. And then pending approval of that test plan, we will move to the final phase of the project where we'll actually be conducting the hardware in the loop testing, integrating algorithms into the open modeling framework, and doing a bunch of red team testing. I'll now transition to the other project, which LBNL is running, which is Project Shielders. And this project is building the collective defense framework, which I briefly mentioned earlier. So Shielders stands for Secure Hub for Information and Electronic Defense of Distributed Energy Resources. There's the website there. It's another RMT project, which was funded out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. My colleague Sean runs this project. I'm the co-PI. And the partners on this project are Kavala, Cornell, and NREL. $4.9 million effort. And again, we're trying to build a collective defense framework, which is built on top of privacy-preserving techniques that will allow electric utilities to share data meant to promote an overall cyber health and collective defense of the power grid. So in Project Shielders, our objectives are to develop, apply, and test techniques that enable collective defense of distribution grids. And we're focusing on grids that have large penetrations of DER and other responsive loads. And this includes electric vehicles, thermostatically controlled loads, demand response assets as well. We are leveraging techniques from the privacy preserving, from privacy preservation methods to enable data sharing and collection, which the goal of which is to avoid exposing sensitive data, so PII, other proprietary data, or things which could be leveraged to harm our national security, and thereby reducing privacy-related liabilities associated with sharing OT data. And we're doing this through the creation of a software platform that will allow utilities to share relevant cybersecurity information with each other without compromising their confidentiality or privacy. The main outcome of the project is going to be a reduction in the reluctance of utilities to share information that could be used to harden utility networks more broadly. The team members on the project, Berkeley Lab is the lead institution responsible for differential privacy algorithm development as well as software development. Kavala is our partner, which is integrating our algorithms into their cloud platform, as well as helping us generate use cases. NREL is again serving as our red team. and Cornell, we're leveraging their expertise in secure AI, as well as in differential privacy algorithm and software development. I want to spend just a second talking about the Kavala platform. So Kavala is building a digital twin for the U.S. territory that can be queried by industry and regulators to inform future actions. A few screenshots of their UI there. So they have this sort of zoom in, zoom out capability where you can run PowerFlow at different resolutions, at different timescales to better understand what's happening in your power grid. There's a lot of data behind their platform. And we are pairing this comprehensive database with differential privacy techniques and are trying to test if we can privatize data which is needed for the training of AI ML algorithms meant for cyber defense. So, and the end goal of the project is to ensure that that the data being queried out of Kavala is differentially private, and then that data that can then be used to train algorithms for detection and mitigation of attacks. A little bit about data privacy at large and how it fits into the electric power system. So there is increasing demand for utilities and vendors to share data. Some of you on this call may have felt some of this pressure in your own institutions. This is due for a variety of reasons, but prominent amongst them are increasing government oversight and a variety of different cloud-based applications. We're increasingly putting our data in the cloud and relying on their security to ensure that our confidentiality is maintained. So this means that entities must balance data protection and data sharing. Obviously, if you wanted to be completely immune to confidentiality issues, you wouldn't share any data, but that's maybe not a solution that we can entertain. And when you think about the current practices for data privacy, techniques that leverage anonymization or sanitization of data, or the 15-15 rule, have been shown to fail to preserve privacy in a variety of instances. Other types of architectures, such as hardware trusted execution environments, which operate on controlling access and trusting the recipient, may also not be suitable for a variety of different tasks. And so we've adopted an approach built on top of differential privacy, which releases randomized answers to different queries of the data in order to protect sensitive attributes. Here's an example of how we envision, actually the framework we're building as part of the Shielders project. So there are a variety of different stakeholders who have data which could be shared. And these different stakeholders can share data with a collective defense framework. But you can see that we add this differential privacy mechanism in series. Here's one here, here's one here, for data that's coming out of some of the different repositories. So we differentially privatize the data. The data remains still under the control of the individual stakeholder, but the query that a machine learning algorithm may make to the data, that is the thing that has been privatized. And then the differentially privatized queries, so the slightly altered data, which masks confidentiality and privacy information, is what's utilized in the collective defense framework for both information sharing and to motivate different control actions which could take place. Another example here of the differential privacy framework which we're trying to stand up here. We assume that the aggregator, the entity which is doing the querying to get information to train their algorithms, is fundamentally an untrusted actor. And this is, we aren't necessarily vetting every AI company which is spinning up and asking for data. But if we give them by default differentially privatized versions of the things that they're looking for, and they're able to train their algorithms to the benefit of our systems, that's a win-win, because we still maintain the privacy of the data under our control, and we get the benefit of some of these new algorithms which are showing up everywhere these days. And again, we apply differential privacy, these different shield icons, on the queries that are being made from the different databases to provide input to the untrusted aggregator, which is then using this information to train their machine learning algorithms. A little bit about the Shielders project timeline. Again, it's a 3-year effort. We are just past the first year here. A variety of actions happening in the early stages of the project included modeling the different security threats, developing a remedial action framework, extending previous versions of software we had worked on in the past, building a data ingestion pipeline, developing different attack scenarios, developing the red team scenarios. And then now, in the second year, we're working on the differential privacy aspects of the queries which different aggregators may be making of our databases. And then later on this year, we'll be integrating into the Kavala K+ platform, integrating the differential privacy mechanisms into their platform. And then in the third year of the project, after DOE approves a test plan, we will be doing experiments in the Kavala platform in response to machine learning queries that are meant to gain knowledge from the system to detect attacks. We'll be testing if the differential privacy mechanisms that we've deployed in that platform do indeed protect privacy and allow us to detect attacks in the system. That's the extent of the talk here. If you have more information, I would encourage you to reach out to my colleague Sean Peisert, who runs the Shielders project, and myself, Dan. I run the Magic project. We'd be happy to talk with you. And if anybody has more information about the work we've done in the past at LBNL or on these two projects, you can find more information at this website here, secpriv.lbnl.gov. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dan. It's fascinating work that you guys are doing. So let's see if people have questions. So we have one from John Haverlack, who presented at the top of the hour. Are we exploring the use of homomorphic encryption for anonymized data sharing?
I'm going to say yes, and I'm not going to answer any more questions on that topic because I've heard that term, but I'm not an encryption fellow. That's a question for my colleague Sean. And John, I would be happy to put you in contact with Sean if you have deeper questions you'd like to ask. But yes, this has been explored in the past for some of the projects we've done at LDNL. And I'm not in a position to offer you any of the pros and cons compared to differential privacy. Sean, awesome. Yeah, totally great. You guys will have a great conversation.
If you have to drop the Wikipedia link in your question.
I saw that. I started to sweat a little bit, but
yes, me too.
Yeah, those can be some tough questions.
Yeah. So I have a question if no one else does. I've heard it described as establishing a pattern of life of an energy system. So that you can use automation tools to detect both kind of what's normal and what's an anomaly. I'm curious about how your universal learning model knows what normal looks like. How does it establish that?
Oh, so that has to be established through repeated interactions with the simulation framework that we've created that exposes the algorithms to what attacks look like. The universal learning framework is more focused on ensuring that the algorithms will perform across topology changes. And so if the grid is reconfigured, if a switch is opened or closed, right? Or if there's suddenly a utility scale solar asset that shows up in one part of the system, right? We don't want to have to retrain the algorithm from scratch in those situations. And so that's kind of where the universal learning framework is focused. In terms of distinguishing from normal operating conditions, we use reinforcement learning for a lot of the algorithms that we train. And the key element that makes reinforcement learning possible is to have a really high fidelity model, simulation, digital twin, these are all the same, of how the grid behaves. And in that environment, you have to show the algorithm what normal is and then what abnormal is. And you do that through creating an attack, and then essentially the agent will take an action, and you tell the agent if it did a good job of mitigating that attack. And during normal operating conditions, you will essentially reward the agent for not reacting, right? So then it ends up learning what an attack looks like, and then what should be treated as normal operating conditions.
Well, thanks for explaining that.
Sure.
So we have a question from Liz. Is the Kavala platform real data and users, or is it simulated?
It's real data as much as real data is available for the different regions that are available. So Kavala has contracts with a variety of a lot of different utilities throughout the U.S. Does have access to AMI data, and that data is being used to run power flows at different geographic resolutions for different locations in the United States. Some data which is not available is interpolated based on data that is available. So I can't say that it's all real. Some of it is semi-real or synthesized. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and we're in a data rich and data poor environment here in Alaska, and so it's good to see how you have addressed that.
Yeah, the last speaker had it right when they said, like, if every distribution grid is unique, right? Every OT system is unique. I've heard the joke: if you've seen 5 OT systems, you've seen 5 OT systems. You have not seen all of the OT systems. So, like, it's definitely a problem that persists across the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and building the trust to create a digital twin is another sort of just a human hurdle, an organizational hurdle. We have another question from John. Where is it? Are you addressing security issues around grid forming versus grid following?
John does not hold back with these questions. So grid forming, grid following, awesome questions. I love it. We are not looking at this issue because there is no suitable simulation tool that I can use in a reasonable amount of time to run these simulations with these devices on realistic grids. We are looking at we're looking at inverter dynamic behavior, but we're looking at on the second-ish time scale. And so there are some aspects of inverters and their behavior that shows up on those timescales. So we look at the IEEE 1547 smart inverter control dynamics, like issues associated with like phase lock loop and other fast acting controllers. We're not looking at. I think there are a lot of really interesting security questions there and those dynamics. I think there needs to be a lot of other work done to create an environment where research can be conducted there. And chief among those is we need better simulation tools to understand what's happening at those time resolutions. Mm-hmm. I'd love to do that work.
Yeah, and I think the connection between simulation and automated anomaly detection and prevention that you're doing, it's not something that a lot of people are aware of. The connection, they're like, why do we need a fancy digital twin? Vanessa, it's like, well, it actually allows you to do real things, not just do fake things. Yep. So I appreciate you exploring this area and sharing it with us. I do have one last question. I think we've got a little bit of time. So if I understood the magic tool, it sounds fascinating. And I personally am still learning about grid stability. So what you proposed sounded really interesting to me. I was curious if you had a situation where you had to suddenly island part of your microgrid, and leave something that was compromised, how would Magic react in a situation like that?
Magic would be the thing that's doing the islanding. That would tell the operator that, in the suite of control decisions you have available to you, some of the things you could do are open and close the switch. You could perhaps change some of the settings on your voltage regulator. You could perhaps adjust some of the behavior in the controllers of your solar or batteries or electric vehicles. So Magic is a tool which we're trying to help. We're trying to give to operators to help them navigate the increasing complexity of their own systems. So if they have choices that Magic could articulate to them and show them what the outcome of their system would look like, which is like that time series I showed you before. What's missing in that picture earlier is telling the operator, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z, this is how this attack would be mitigated, right? And so Magic is essentially giving options to the operator, which they may not have considered before, just due to the fact that the system is so complex now. It's hard for folks to make decisions holistically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I agree. I think that the operators have an overwhelming amount of choice and also
It's only getting worse.
complexity, and you've
Yeah.
got to respond fast. So I think that's a great tool for them to have.
Yep. Yeah, we don't believe in a world where the operator is taken out of the loop and you have automated control. Like, we're trying as much as possible to enhance the ability of the operator to do their own jobs, and then to try and show them what different outcomes could look like based on decisions that they could make.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Dan, for what you've shared today. Really exciting work. I know John can connect with you guys, but I'd love to talk more about all of this offline.
Would be happy to. Thank you guys for the opportunity. I look forward to perhaps talking more in the future.
Okay. Man, what do we have in store for us next? Okay, so next up, I'd like to welcome our next presenters, Todd Ponto, the Director of Operational Technology and NERC Compliance at Scott Madden, and Ed Jenkin, the CEO of the Railbelt Reliability Council. So Todd joined Scott Madden in 2020, bringing 30 years of experience specializing in cyber and physical security for various industries, including public schools, retail, and utilities. He has consulted and advised energy, gas and oil, and water utilities during the past 10 years, which are years when we've seen an increase of cyber risk. So interesting. Before Scott Madden, Todd served as a NERC contractor, auditor, and subject matter expert for NERC's Grid X3 and Grid X4 exercises. And he led energy utilities to achieve compliant NERC SIP programs. He also designed and directed large-scale implementation projects of energy management systems. Todd earned a master's degree in information security from Capella University and holds certifications in CISSP, GCIP, and PSP. He is also a proud U.S. Navy veteran. Thank you for your service, and served in the Gulf War. Ed Jenkin came to the Railbelt Reliability Council with over 35 years of experience in railbelt utilities. He most recently was Chief Operating Officer and Chief Energy Transformation Officer for Matanuska Electrical Association. Ed is a professional engineer in the state of Alaska, having acquired his electrical engineering degree from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, so an alumni. Welcome. He also has a master's degree in cross-cultural studies from the Fuller Theological Seminary. Welcome, Todd, and Ed. Welcome, Todd and Ed. So I will yield the floor to you guys, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Again, thank you. Ed Jenkin, Chief Executive Officer for the Railbelt Reliability Council. And to start out, just wanted to give you a brief little history of standards development before we get into how critical standards are with respect to issues related to security on the electric grid. The RSE, strangely enough, is following a similar pattern to that in the lower 48. I mean, the lower 48, you had interconnection of the utilities back in the 60s that resulted in some voluntary standards on how you operate the system. Nevertheless, there were a number of outages that are regional in the 60s that caused the federal government to stand up the North American Electric Reliability Council to administer standards. And initially those standards were voluntary until they saw some significant blackouts, one especially in the Northeast that affected power across the Great Lakes area down into New York, including Canada. So again, Federal Regulatory Commission was given additional authority. They became the Electric Reliability Organization for the interconnected lower 48 and were authorized to mandate standards be followed in 2007. So similarly, seeing what's happening in the lower 48, watching the grid up here as well as, in the 1990s, Fairbanks became interconnected with the Anchorage and Matsu area. Homer was already interconnected. voluntary operational standards were developed, but nevertheless, we consistently saw pretty large disturbances. So in 2015, the Regulatory Commission asked the legislator to form a reliability organization that could enforce standards. The legislators in 2020 passed the enabling legislation, and in 2023, the Railbelt Reliability Council was stood up as the electric reliability organization for Alaska. And in 2024, we started developing standards. Todd Ponto is part of that team working with the RRC, with his expertise being in critical infrastructure protection standards that we've asked him to help us with as we go through standards development. And we're now working through that process, have reliability standards before the Regulatory Commission of Alaska for approval, and then are working on development of critical infrastructure protection standards. Todd, why don't we go next slide? So a little bit about the Railbelt Reliability Council before we get into standards development. The RRC is, first of all, a stakeholder organization. It is overseen by a 13-member stakeholder board, and that board contains members of all the railbelt utilities, but it's balanced against non-utilities as well. So the board is balanced between utility stakeholders and non-utility stakeholders, such as independent power producers, large consumer organization representatives, small consumer organization representative, and various other representatives, including environmental. And not only is this board balanced between utilities and non-utilities, it's also balanced between those who produce energy and use energy. So first of all, it is a stakeholder organization, and the process outlined below really focuses on that, where we use working groups, where a notice is provided of development of a standard to those individuals who signed up to receive that data, and then a working group is formed that contains balanced stakeholder representation concerning whatever the standard is that's being developed. And then that working group, through a number of meetings, works with our technical advisory committee, which Todd is on, to develop those standards and finally come to an agreement on standards to move forward, which eventually move forward with a recommendation to the RC board. And our board would then pass them on to the Regulatory Commission of Alaska for approval. Moving on to, so critical infrastructure protection standards, really the purpose of this conversation is those are critical standards that were first developed and approved by NERC back in 2008. So the North American Reliability Corporation developed and approved critical infrastructure protection standards. These standards focus on protecting cyber assets and supporting the resiliency of the grid, where other standards might focus on overall reliability and specific reliability in the operation of the system. These standards, critical infrastructure protection, you focus on the cyber assets and the physical protection of the facilities. And though NERC adopted these as the Electric Reliability Organization Lower 48, because within Alaska there is no interconnection to any other region, any other state, there is no jurisdiction for the federal organization to come in and enforce standards in the state of Alaska. So no connection, it's an isolated grid within Alaska, where Alaska therefore has that jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction is now working through the Commission of Alaska and through the Railbelt Reliability Council to stand up standards. And we could just adopt the NERC standards, except for the issues associated with the differences in the grids that NERC oversees versus the ones that the RRC oversees. Specifically, there's a huge difference in overall scale. A disturbance in Alaska that in the rail belt that would see a frequency excursion on the grids that NERC oversees wouldn't even be noticed for the most part. Our disturbances takes about 1/40th of the size of a disturbance from the Eastern Interconnect to cause a problem on our grid that would be seen on the Eastern Interconnect, meaning 2,500 megawatts of generation going offline and somewhere on the Eastern Interconnect would cause a disturbance of about a hertz, a tenth of a hertz, sorry. Similarly, it takes about 60 megawatts here in the rail belt to cause a similar disturbance. So a lot of the references in the NERC standards that have to do with what size of disturbance that they're overseeing are not applicable to Alaska. And we, through studies and analysis, have to determine what the appropriate size is. And those studies have pretty much been carried out. So we're now looking at really defining the NERC standards, refining the NERC standards, and bringing them down to a level that's appropriate for Alaska. So what type of disturbance do we need to mitigate against? What type of infrastructure do we need to look at to ensure that those cyber assets associated with that infrastructure is protected? And that's the work that is really being led by the Technical Advisory Committee of the Railbelt Reliability Council, and looking at working with stakeholders now to identify the level of infrastructure that needs to be protected and where that infrastructure needs to be protected and how it's protected. So with that introduction, Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through those standards that are being developed and how they're affect the reliability on the rail belt electric grid.
Great. Well, thank you, Ed. So one of the things I'm going to do is for everybody is I'm going to go over the standards that are currently in development. There is 14 of them. They're numbered from SIP 2 to 15. With those, there's actually, turns out, there's 168 sub-requirements that the utilities or registered entities would have to follow. I'm not going to get into extreme detail on every single one of these standards, or we'd be here all day or all week. So I'm going to give you a high level, keep it to simply try to explain what each one of these SIP standards is for, its purpose, and how it's there to help make the grid more reliable through making it more secure. So the first standard, which is the basis, is really the SIP 2. So with this standard, you have to go through and define exactly which cyber assets are the most critical, which ones would cause the outages, that would cause the impact. So if somebody was to hack them or change settings on them or misuse them, these would cause an impact. So in generation, it could be changes to the generator, controls, could be vibration monitors that would trip it. So then all of a sudden, nobody has power. And there's things within the substations like the relays. So this standard, you'd have to define the assets are in scope, and then you're going to categorize them into certain levels. So high, medium, low. So this is really how serious is the impact. In the case of high, it goes to control centers. So control centers are what actually operates the entire electrical grid. They operate all of the power plants that are in that area. So they're the most critical because if you were to perform cyber attacks, you could affect the rest of the facilities and the other assets that are in that grid for that particular control unit. So that's why those control centers are labeled as high. Um, and there's a few other minor things within that SIP2 standard, but that's the main one that sets the groundwork for all the rest, because you have to know what you need to protect, and then the other ones are going to define how you're going to protect them. So then we get into SIP3, and this one is really your governance. This is going to be about how all those utilities, those registered entities, have to develop their policies and plans and define how are they going to protect these systems. What are they going to do? One of the key items out of this is they also have to define a senior person who is representing that registered entity, who has the ability to sign off that, yes, we've gone through, we've done everything we should, we're compliant. Or they're the ones that, when you go and there's an issue, you go to that person and they're the ones responsible to ensure that that utility would follow through. The other piece that within SIP3 is the lowest level of impact, which would be the low impact. The security controls that are required to be followed are defined within that standard. For the mediums and highs, because they have the most impact, the rest of the standards that we're going to talk about, they're going to be applicable to those. So there is a difference. A majority of the substations, the power plants, will fall under low, and that's the same within the lower 48. So the next one. So what's really important as well, along with cybersecurity, is ensuring that everyone is trained and that they are trustworthy. So part of the SIP4 standard is that everyone that is going to have access to the cyber assets have security training done through awareness, through formal annual trainings. They have background checks done, and they have in writing established, granting and removing access. So if they're supposed to have access to a certain group of, say, relays or the power plant, because of their job, they would be approved access. If they switch jobs, then that access would be taken away. And SIP4 really is the standard that talks about how you have to do all that. Part of one thing to bring up on the standards is all of the standards, when NERC developed them to begin with, were based on NIST. So they come from North American National Standards, and they were just adopted to fit the electrical utility industry. So, energy and power. So that way these are very much tailored for this environment. And SIP5 falls right into that, because SIP5 is around securing remote access. So when someone who's not located right at the plant has to be able to get into it to check on, what's going on. I have a fault, I have a condition, I need to be able to work on it. How do I do that securely? And that's what this standard defines, along with the fact that the registered entities have to set up and monitor the communications, looking for unusual activity, malicious code, things that are inherently bad that you don't want affecting your most critical assets. There is 2 physical security standards among the SIP standards, and SIP is critical infrastructure protection. SIP6 deals with physical security of the cyber assets themselves. So within, say, a power plant, you may come down and define of the 2,000 cyber assets might be there, it may be only 100 of them are actually critical, that within 15 minutes could cause an outage if they were misused or compromised or destroyed. And so this standard is saying, okay, of those ones you identified, those 200, you have to ensure that you physically protect those as well, as including escorting of visitors and tracking who comes in and out. SIP7 deals more on the cybersecurity device, the physical security. Here, you're ensuring that your systems are patched. You have malicious code protection, which is really like antivirus, anti-malware. You have, if you're using password-based systems, you have complex passwords that you're required to change them, over a certain amount of time period. And that you have to track and authorize everyone who has access, electronic access to these systems. I mean, there's some additionals. These are just kind of the high level of each of these standards. They actually go into much more detail. SIP 8. So part of all this is ensuring that you're prepared in case something actually happens. So SIP 8 is incident reporting and response planning. For a lot of companies, this also could be business continuity planning or contingency planning. So in this case, you're focusing on the cybersecurity incident. So you're focusing here is, if I had something happen, what should I do? And the standard goes through things like ensuring that you're properly identifying, you're doing detection, you're doing mitigation for it, you're doing containment, and who are the key members responsible for doing these different elements. What's really important about this is not only for a cybersecurity event, but, knock on wood, it doesn't ever happen up there, but you literally have something major happen, such as an explosion at a power plant. And so ensuring who can do what, and you have backups in case those individuals somehow are not available or they're hurt or whatever it takes, that you still know who you need to get a hold of to get these things up and running. SIP 9 deals with the actual set of instructions you need, that if one of these cyber assets is compromised or destroyed, that you have a very detailed set of instructions, how you would replace it, how you would repair it. And, SIP 8 dealt with how to isolate it. SIP 9 talks about, okay, after you've isolated it, how do I clear it off? Or do I have to literally, that particular piece of equipment, I've got to replace with a brand new one to get myself up and running. And both of these standards require testing to be done so that everybody who's responsible to perform these actions know how to do it, and you're practicing that at least every 15 calendar months. SIP 10 is around configuration change management and vulnerability assessments. So the big thing here, and this is a huge one, and this is huge across all industries, is really ensuring you're documenting all changes that have taken place. So if you change governor settings at a power plant or protection settings at a substation, you know what was changed, who changed it, when it was changed, so that if something goes wrong, you know what was changed so that you could go back to the original settings. You also have validation that all these changes have been looked at, reviewed, and approved prior to them taking place, and which is key. The other one is that you perform periodically vulnerability assessments. So you're going to scan your systems. You're going to look for possible ways for these systems to be exploited. Many systems will show vulnerabilities, but they may not actually be effective. So if you had a vulnerability because it says you have an SSH certificate that's not valid, well, if these systems aren't connected to the outside world where they could go to an Entrust or other places to validate that certificate, that's a particular vulnerability that really isn't an issue. So part of these assessments that are done periodically is going through what was determined, or what was the results, I should say, of the assessment, and determine, are they real vulnerabilities to our systems, or are they ones that would happen if we change something? And then you know if a change gets done that now you have to address this possible issue. Along with not only having to protect your systems, you have to protect the information about your system. So that's where SIP 11 now comes into place. SIP 11 standard establishes that the registered entities, utilities, have to have a process to protect the information both at rest, so when you store it locally or you store it in a vehicle, and in transit. So here is important is in the rail belt and a lot of rural areas. I'm from Vermont, so I fit into a lot of the same type of areas. Your power plants, your substations could be considerable amount of hours away from where your corporate office is or your maintenance depot is. So your guys going out in the field, well, many times they're going to carry a lot of the sensitive information with them. So this standard helps to set up to say, okay, if they're going to have this, how would they protect it while they're driving from their normal spot, the depot, the corporate office, out to these other locations? And when they're there, what do they do to protect it? Along with determining exactly, which information really needs to be protected. Next few are newer ones that NERC came about. So SIP 12 deals with many of the utilities have more than one control center. So they have a primary control center, but if something was to happen to that one, they have a backup control center. The systems, or the SCADA systems, as we would call them, that operate the grid or the power plant, send information back and forth. So these systems would be located both at the primary and the backup. That method of communication used to tie those systems together has to be protected. So this standard defines, how would you physically and electronically protect those? So it gets into the type of information that needs to be protected, and it turns around and identifies that the registered entity has to document their process to protect it, and it has to meet certain criteria. The next one then gets into supply chain. So what we're talking about here is, say you use a Cisco switch. Well, you're buying that switch. It's made by somebody else. The parts could have came from lots of different places. Do you know that as the utility who's buying this or buying certain software? So this standard was around ensuring that you set up risk assessments on your vendors that you're using, on the equipment that you're purchasing, so you know where it's coming from. Is it made in China? Is it made in Russia? Is it made in the US? And if there's parts associated to where they. The same thing with your vendors that you may be using for support. So where are they really located? Are you using vendors that are located in China or North Korea, and under the federal government saying, maybe they're not so trustworthy and you shouldn't be using them. So you turn around, and this standard defines the elements necessary for the utility to create a risk assessment and mitigate any type of risk that they identify to deal with purchasing something. As an example where this is really important is a number of people might have heard it. There was a thing called CrowdStrike that happened. That was a bug that dealt with and affected all these Microsoft systems. It shut down airline flights, everything else. CrowdStrike was a single source that was sending out things on behalf of Microsoft. And part of that supply chain is, okay, it's one thing to say in the rail belt, a cyber attack to Homer. But if I wanted to take down all of the rail belt, which is a number of utilities, they do things all different, they have different securities, how could I do that? So in supply chain, you would look for a common device that was used everywhere. So if everybody used SEL 311 relays, then you might want to attack the SEL manufacturer and put a bogue into those systems. So when they came to Alaska, they would give the back door into all of these particular systems. And this is to help, mitigate those risks. Only a few more left. So SIP 14 is the other security one. This one is for transmission facilities only. And this one literally is for security of the facilities. So it comes down to that certain substations, if affected, could cause cascading effects. So as Ed talked about, the blackout that knocked down in 2003, knocked down all these places around the northern part of the states. That was a cascade. So that was one substation went down that caused other substations to crash within the grid. So this standard came up and said, okay, if I have a particular substation that's critical, and if it goes down, it causes other ones, that I have to add a little bit more protections to this facility. It might be that you have to put a concrete barrier in because the transformers are too easily to be shot from a distance, or there's hunting in the area and that, stray bullets could hit it. The last one is new, that's just coming out, that everybody in lower 48 is getting prepared for, is SIP 5 dealt with monitoring on the exterior perimeter, looking for people trying to get in. SIP 15 here deals with that you have monitoring inside your network, so that you're looking for that equipment that might have been compromised when it came into your place, individuals plugging things in, or just even literally, you can have some systems that go bad, that pass bad data, that literally start causing effects. And this monitoring is designed to detect those, and you can mitigate them much faster before you have major reliability issues. So I threw a lot at you very quickly. So with that, I will open up everything to questions.
Thank you, Todd and Ed. Ed, did you want to add something before we jump into the questions?
Yeah, now that we've been through the SIP standards, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call already have some knowledge of those. Again, just wanted to reiterate that we're going through the process now of developing those standards and for the rail belt. And that if there are individuals that are interested in tracking that process or even participating in that process, there's opportunity to do so. They can go to the RRC's website, and up on top, onto the main items, there's something called opportunities. They can click on that link to opportunities, and they can sign up for receiving information on the development of these standards, or if they have a specific interest or a specific expertise that they may think is appropriate, there's an application process where you can ask to participate in one of the working groups that are being developed, that are going through these standards. And I see John has hit the link down there and post everyone akrc.org. So again, as we go through these standards, these will be for the Alaska Rail Belt, and people that wish to participate. Because we are a stakeholder organization, certainly we're interested in being able to communicate what we're doing and allowing people to just track along, even if they're not on the working groups, if they just want to know the process and where we are in the process. So thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful that people can follow along and know the progress. And I think that leads us to John's question, which is, when will these standards be required and how might they impact energy costs in Alaska? And then following on from that, what should utilities be doing to prepare for when they're required?
Todd, do you want to start with that one as far as when on timeline?
Yes, I can give some. So the first thing is, and a refresh, as Ed put it out earlier, was back in 2018, the rail belt utilities actually created the initial set of standards for all of them as a voluntary. So a number of utilities have started to implement a lot of the pieces, and been doing it for over the years. With the working groups, we are right now looking at hopefully going through all of the standards in development and having those ready for the board to go up to RAC for approval end of August of this year.
And then the timeframes on when you would have to comply with those standards as far as the implementation period, it can be as long as 3 years, depending upon the level of work required to become compliant with those standards. I think John had another question there about cost. We recognize that. There probably is a cost associated with implementing these standards. I don't expect it to be to the level that it provides much impact to rates that a utility would charge. Most utilities already have security associated with their high-level facilities, which are their dispatch centers. The question is going to be, as they look out into the field, how much additional work is required based upon how substations are classified. Most of those facilities, the huge majority of those facilities, are going to be low priority facilities, as consistent with the lower 48, and won't rise to the level of having much additional work required at those substations. So we're not anticipating a huge cost impact, and what cost impact there is would be phased in over a number of years as we work towards full implementation of these standards.
Thank you both for that. And a reminder to people, if you have any questions, big or small, just drop them in the chat. I had one, which is, you had mentioned IPPs at one point, and as we look forward into the future of Alaska's energy landscape, we expect, more IPPs than we have now. How many? Nobody knows. And I'm curious how that will affect this standards work that you're doing. Will there be more challenges to compliance or adherence to the requirements?
Yeah, I'm going to say that, presently the impact of independent power producers is reasonably small. The majority of them are small and connected to the distribution system. And we still have to determine for those smaller facilities, does the RSC directly enforce those upon those facilities, or is it actually the responsibility of the utilities who they connect to provide that enforcement, and we work directly with the utilities? But there is going to be either way some level of impact. But again, that should be right in the middle of the planning process. That should be right in the middle of their system design as they work with the utility to meet interconnection requirements and interconnection standards in order to connect onto the grid in a manner that is not only provides safe operation, but also reliable and operation and the ability to continue to operate during various disturbances on the grid.
The other piece I think I want to add to this is, as this is compliance doesn't always mean security. So for these particular standards, what it's really trying to do is ensure that everybody at least has a minimum level of security applied. That's the reason why NERC did it in the lower 48 was many utilities applied nothing because it would affect their bottom line. And, a lot of them didn't think about it, especially generation, because generation doesn't make money if they're not running. So if you attack a power plant, it makes zero money. So that was the ones where they really started to look at, you need to put in protections. Also, of course, if generation goes away, we all lose our lights. And as an end user who's in a cold environment, yeah, losing power and not be able to run heat and everything else, yeah, that's a big problem. Well, thank you all for your time, and we appreciate it.
I was muted. Thank you, both of you, very much. If you had a few more questions, maybe we can email them to follow up. I think this is a very interesting conversation about compliance, security, costs. The voluntary nature and the early adoption is really interesting as well. So I appreciate what you shared thus far.
Yeah, and if we did cut off before you got all the questions answered, if you could, yeah, feel free to let them know that, you know, we can respond to those questions. We'll respond directly to them with those questions, and if they forward them on, we'll make sure they get answered.
Okay, well, thank you both for your time. It's really important work, and we're really grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to transition to our final presentation of the day, which is cybersecurity and compliance. We're in a theme now. Cybersecurity and compliance at electrical utilities by Chris Green. So Chris is a seasoned cybersecurity professional with extensive experience in security assessments, risk management, and regulatory compliance. As a cybersecurity consultant and VCISO, which you'll have to explain because I don't know what that one means, but the V virtual, anyways, he helps organize, identify security risks, strengthen defenses, and meet compliance requirements. His expertise spans network and application security, risk assessments, and frameworks such as PCI DSS, NIST, CSF, and more. So we are honored to have you here, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining today. It's been many rounds of very informative talks. I hope to add a little bit to it and then let everybody get on to their lunch plans. I'm going to talk today about cybersecurity and compliance at electrical utilities, more with a focus on developing and or maintaining a cybersecurity program. A little bit about me. There we go. I've been working in information security for about 10 years. As mentioned, I do a lot of pen testing, compliance assessment. VCISO, to answer that question, that's just consulting at a higher level for some organizations that might not have a cybersecurity information security officer, right? I help with security program and policy development, advisement, etc. And not to overshadow the original presenter who I took over for last minute, Rob Waite created this deck and I'm going to fill in for him. He's our Director of Governance, Risk, and Compliance. He's been in information security since I was a little kid, starting out in the U.S. Air Force and working for years in the DoD, and now since 2013 has run Structured's GRC department. And just really quick, Structured, some of the practices that we maintain, just for a little bit of background of where we're coming from, where I'm coming from with this governance, risk, and compliance. We do cybersecurity, cloud services, data center solutions, networking, UC, and secure managed services. So we run the gamut, but as a member of the GRC team, we are kind of included in all of those. But to talk about today's agenda, I'm not here to sell. I'm here to really give my oversight, or not oversight, but my experience on what I see when I perform security assessments from any vertical, really, but with a skew towards utilities. So agenda, talk about some challenges, threat and attack vectors, common attack vectors, assessment and testing, and how to develop some tips and pointers for developing and maintaining a security program. Starting with challenges, the first thing whenever we go in for an assessment is really understand, what are we protecting? What are you protecting? What do you need to protect? And that's all about discovery. So finding that sensitive data, understanding what there is in your environment, whether that's hardware, software, intellectual property, etc. It all starts with understanding what you have and what needs to be protected before you can really move on. And that's important, especially like if there is a dramatic incident such as a ransomware attack. There is the cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure act, or commonly referred to as CERCIA, which is a law that was enacted in 2022. The rule is still being it's still in the proposal stage. It still has yet to be ratified. Expecting this to be ratified sometime, I believe, this fall, and then to fully go into effect in early 2026. But essentially, what this means, if you have a security incident, the security incidents need to be reported to the government within 72 hours. And if you do end up making a ransomware payment, having to report that to CISA within 24 hours of that payment. So understanding the point of this is awareness and understanding your inventory, and especially that critical data, especially if there's any sort of customer data that's lost, breached, etc., that gets out there, you will be affected by this. Common areas of weakness that we see, a lot of these are going to relate directly to those SIP standards that were just mentioned. But whenever we do assessments, whether it's for compliance or you're just having a standard security assessment, the NIST cybersecurity framework assessment, a risk assessment, etc., configuration management is a big one. Configuration management really involves having a standardized configuration, a secure configuration that you roll out for each asset in your environment. Whether you're following standards developed by the Center for Internet Security, CIS, or that you develop on your own. Change management, as was mentioned, change management is having a secure and documented process, more the documented process of when you introduce a change into your environment, what are you changing, making sure that it's documented, making sure that it's approved by all stakeholders, making sure that there is a rollback plan, etc. And then patch management and vulnerability management. Always very important. Patch management, I'm sure everybody is pretty well familiar with. However, oftentimes what I see during assessments are there is a very strong patch management program for operating systems, particularly Windows operating systems and servers, but it starts to falter and fall off a little bit when it comes to third-party software, Apache web servers that are exposed to the internet, etc., can sometimes fall behind. So ensuring that your patch management program is overarching across all assets. And then piggybacking off of that, vulnerability management, regularly scanning for vulnerabilities and having a process for dealing with those vulnerabilities and remediating those vulnerabilities, a structured process that prioritizes criticals and highs, right? And then works down the list into mediums and lows. Reducing exposure to the internet, especially with older environments or environments that aren't updated as frequently, tend to see a lot of exposed services to the internet that maybe don't need to be exposed this day and age. Conducting regular cybersecurity assessments, very infrequent, changing default passwords immediately. If you adhere to any compliance standard, in almost every standard, there's a requirement to change default passwords. I still commonly see default passwords in use even on critical infrastructure. And as I mentioned, conducting inventory of assets, have to have that inventory of assets to understand what might be lost in some sort of attack. Other areas of weakness, get more into policy, right? Develop and exercise incident response plans. It's very common that there will be an incident response plan in the IT environment, but not in other environments, not in OT environments, not in more business critical environments. Particularly if, say, a site is lost or a site goes down. which goes into backup of OT and IT systems, right? If a site does go down, is there a solid backup plan? Oftentimes I see that, yes. Very many times, quite a few times, we find that backups are made, but they're not tested. So you have been backing up all year long. You think that you're great. A ransomware attack comes in or a system fails, and upon restoration, the backups just aren't working, which slows recovery time and ultimately costs the business money. And then conducting cybersecurity awareness training. One of the big pillars in developing a security program is ensuring that all of your users understand what they are to do in a cybersecurity event, a security event, whether that's receiving a phishing email to triggering a ransomware deployment, ensuring that your staff is well trained to respond to those, or at least to report those events to the people who can respond to them, is critically important. And while I would say that in this area, many organizations have really gotten on the ball, especially as cybersecurity insurance comes into play, we still often find organizations that aren't quite there. And then as you're looking at your risk, or as you're looking at developing your policy, it's good to understand your risk. So part of policy development is going to be performing assessments, and you can start small. If you have a fledgling security program, start small with, say, the CIS controls before you graduate to, say, the NIST cybersecurity framework. And CIS is broken down into three categories. Or can be classify a business into three categories, which is, just starting out, medium, and then more mature. Perform those internally. Understand as you're performing those what your risks are, where your risks are. Use the MITRE attack framework. If you're not familiar with that, MITRE has an attack framework that shows threat vectors and techniques to really help organizations understand where they might initially be breached, and if they are breached there, how an attacker might make their way to the goods, to the intellectual property, whatever that is, customer information, etc. And then as you're building out that risk register, make sure that it's kept up. So as you identify risk and respond to those risks by implementing controls, etc., make sure you keep that risk register updated. And then another common challenge, especially in OT environments, is legacy infrastructure. So common have separate groups between IT, cybersecurity, and those who operate the OT environments, ICS environments, which many times that's by design, separation of duties, but there does still need to be some interaction between those groups. And oftentimes I find them to be completely siloed, which doesn't work well for building out security programs and understanding each other's needs and risks and vulnerabilities. Legacy infrastructure also tends to be set and forget, where they don't get upgraded for long periods of time. In these scenarios, sometimes that's just because that's the way it is. We can't take systems offline, especially in OT, but that's just how it is, and certainly a challenge to be dealt with. So looking at some threats and vectors, commonly exploited attack vectors, I have a lot on screen here, but the top three are underlined. The most common way for an attacker to get in these days, right now, the most popular way is phishing and social engineering. If someone can get a credential from a user, an attacker can get a credential from a user, then that attacker might be able to access systems that are less secure, right? There might be, it says remote access exploits here. You might have an open SSH port, open to the internet, open to the public, or an RDP port that, with these credentials, an attacker might be able to access systems, or exploit a system leveraging a vulnerability that allows for, say, remote code execution to gain access to a system. And then once they're inside of your network, commonly we find weak network segmentation, where critical systems are maybe not necessarily fully segmented with a firewall or through other ACLs, access control lists, from commonly used systems from, say, the workstation VLAN. Which showing here an example of segmentation. This is more skewed towards PCI environment, right? Where in the top right, there's the card data environment, the CDE, and the top left, shared services are both protected by firewalls from the corporate LAN, as I just mentioned. And then threats to AI or from AI are find as AI is being rolled out. Organizations are slow to respond. One great resource for understanding the security risks of using AI is the MITRE corporation has MITRE Attack for AI at atlas.mitre.org. Atlas stands for Adversarial Threat Landscape for AI Systems. Great tool, again, for understanding attack vectors, whether you are implementing AI into your software or your services. You really want to understand how could, as you train those LLMs, as you train those models, how can those models protect the output, right? You don't want your systems giving away company secrets, intellectual property. You don't want those giving out customer information, as well as inputs. If customers are using AI in your systems by inputting their own information, you don't want them to be able to, say, red team the system to output incorrect or dangerous information, right? Information that could cause physical or local harm. And then, of course, the threats to and from generative AI. If your user base is using generative AI in their everyday workflow, how do you protect your IP from being entered? You can train them not to, but sometimes you really need to add some controls to prevent that. Bullet point case studies, I added that in there because at atlas.mitre.org, there are a lot of case studies to help organizations better understand those threats and different scenarios that they can protect against. As we perform assessments, especially in the AI governance area, we tend to see three types of organizations, as shown here. In the light blue on the left, there's kind of the head in the sand mentality where the IT and security teams say, hey, just don't use it. This is, they just educate their users. Don't use it. It's dangerous. We're not gonna use it at all. You're not allowed to. Then there are those who go a step beyond and they implement some sort of controls, web access controls, and just shut it down. And then we see the organizations who have adopted it and embraced it. They've built out an acceptable use policy, and as they're integrating that AI into their processes and workflows. And that's taught by having the policy, number one, using the NIST AI risk management framework, and including AI usage and safety techniques in their annual cybersecurity training. Looking at testing and assessment, really, once you've kind of built a cybersecurity program or an information security program in general, first best to assess. I think penetration testing is one of the last things that should be done. But performing an assessment, whether it's a risk assessment or just controls assessment, I think the NIST Special Publication 853A is a great tool for performing those assessments. Controls map directly from the NIST cybersecurity framework, so there's a lot of integration there. And that can really give you kind of an idea of your security maturity or where you're at. Or at the very least, whether you're looking at your controls or performing a risk assessment, you have an understanding of where your risks are or might be. so that you can then address them and start patching up some of the holes before you move on to penetration testing. Once it's time to move on to penetration testing, there's a lot to consider. What all do you test? So the big one, external, that's going to be your public-facing assets, everything that's not inside your private network. That could be your local network, your local perimeter, testing the firewall or any locally hosted web servers or applications, even cloud services, whether you're using Azure or Google Cloud Platform, GCP, AWS, etc. That's all part of your external infrastructure, especially with Azure moving. Azure kind of moves that internal network externally in a way. As we're moving email to the cloud, we're moving file storage to the cloud. So ensuring that cloud services are tested, applications and APIs. Compromising an application might not compromise internal data and systems, but certainly could lead to the compromise of, say, a customer database, which if leaked could cause reputational damage, leading to financial damage, etc. I always recommend including social engineering. Social engineering, as mentioned a few times, not just by me, but by others. That's the leading attack. And it's not just phishing, it's voice phishing, otherwise known as vishing, SMS phishing. So phishing via text message with, say, a malicious link. I just highly recommend to always include some form of social engineering, because that's always going to be the first attempt by a malicious actor. And then physical testing. This was, again, mentioned in one of the SIP standards, but your network could be tough as nails, but on the outside. But if someone was able to walk into an office, into a way station, etc., and then just plug into your internal network, then it could all be over. And that's not the only thing to think about with testing. Is, sometimes you do have locks, sometimes you do have procedures. You have somebody at a gate or at the front of the office. Will those people stop a malicious actor from just walking right through? Will they check and require them to log in? Can the tester social engineer their way right past that person to bypass those procedures? Can they, appeal to their human side that we all have and give a sob story and get right by? So I always recommend including physical where it makes sense as well. And then listed change-based here. Penetration testing, especially if you're following any sort of compliance framework, is usually an annual exercise. But anytime there's a big change in your environment, it's always advisable to have some sort of test, even if it's not a widespread and more focused test. Red team, blue team, purple team. Really, when it comes to penetration testing, I think there is a lot of value of having both your penetration tester and your security team, whether it's a full-on blue team or a SOC or it's one person. Having your penetration tester work closely with that inside contact or contacts is very valuable, because you can, throughout the assessment, learn what you're missing, as well as very quickly learn what is being found, or what might be able to be quickly bypassed if you do have controls in place. There's just a lot of collaboration and a lot of communication, and I think it adds a whole lot of value to you as an organization. Also, when you're planning your penetration testing, you may hear terms about white box, black box. They're really disclosed or non-disclosed testing formats. Disclosed is more, you provide the scope to your tester and they just go about testing. And in non-disclosed, you wait to disclose any information about your environment and let that tester or team of testers find as much about your organization as possible. And that is really kind of to see what a malicious actor might be able to find on their own. So to learn about your company and find any data that might be out there. Maybe there are lists of email addresses that you can contact an organization, a hosting organization, to take down, etc. And then always bundle in a tabletop exercise at the end, if you can, and learning all of the attack vectors from your penetration test. You can then either whether you do it internally, or have your provider do it for you, but go through the attack scenarios and ensure that your team knows all the steps to take for incident response, and ensure that you're prepared for when a real incident occurs. Multi-factor authentication. Have to mention this. It was mentioned earlier, I believe, but phishing and replay resistance testing is important, because anymore phishing is not just calling up trying to get passwords, or just having someone submit their username and password into a link, because we also have MFA, but there are attack vectors now, or attack techniques, that kind of sit hardware in the middle of your, say, Azure or Microsoft 365 login page to capture that MFA authentication, where that gives a session token that can then be replayed in the attacker's browser, providing them full access without needing to put in a username, password, etc., into that user's Microsoft 365 instance, which would usually get them access to Outlook and email, and OneDrive for files, etc. And this can be done with or without social engineering. So if you don't even need to include social engineering in your test, you just provide your tester with a testing account, and that's set up with MFA. So when building out a security program, always recommend the W's. As you define it, number one, who are the responsible parties? What are we trying to protect? Where's the sensitive data? Kind of what I talked about in the beginning, understanding what needs to be protected, where the assets are. If you're being held to any sort of compliance standards, understanding the key dates and objectives that need to be hit, milestones, etc. And then build that program appropriately to make those deadlines. Where's everything stored, and why? Ultimately, why do we need a security program? Number one, because it's good, but usually it's going to involve some sort of compliance framework that you need to adhere to, PCI, SIP, NERC-CIP, etc. And then understanding how you're going to implement it. So to build it out, you might need to introduce architecture. You might need to introduce new technologies, and plan and budget. So understanding how you're going to roll that out is important as well. Policy development is a big one in developing a security program. Security program is built on policies. So your policies really do need to be documented to what your business is. Every business is going to have different policies, different documentation, and building that documentation out can be a headache at first if you don't already have some to work off of. You can always go to SANS. There are many templates for various policies on SANS. I'm not afraid to say to start out with AI. It can be a huge help for, especially with some creative prompt engineering, to get you started on any particular policy that you can then tailor and massage into something that aligns with your company's requirements. Or you can always outsource it to a third party, and be done with it. And as you're developing your security program, you also want to think about your security maturity level. So this is the security maturity model from Gartner. Theirs is more of a 5-step, where it begins with initial and ends in optimizing. Essentially, right, if you're new to the game, you're going to have those ad hoc activities. Executives and C-levels might be slightly aware. But as you grow and as you start to become more mature, as you're having those annual risk assessments and annual framework assessments, even like PCI assessments or any sort of compliance assessments, you're constantly improving and constantly refining till you get to the point where Number 5, as it states there, you're in a risk-aware culture, and any refinement for changes in business, technology, compliance, et cetera, is really fluid, and you can make those changes quickly. In the utilities department, the cybersecurity capability maturity model, or C2M2, from the Department of Energy, is a great resource to follow for developing that security maturity. Just starting with number 1 is a self-evaluation. As you can see in the inputs there, you start with a self-evaluation. That is the activity, is to conduct that self-evaluation, and the output is your evaluation report. And that will lead you into step 2, where you start with that previous output, the C2M2 self-evaluation report, and so on. The end of that, the output of 2 is list gaps and potential consequences. That's the first part of step 3. So very procedural and very easy to follow, and that'll lead you into step 5, where you start looking at domains. This example here is domain 1 for the asset domain, using maturity indicator levels, MIL 1, 2, and 3. And that's where you really start to refine it. But the C2M2, I think, is a good maturity model to follow. You can also, if you are just starting out and you are following the NIST cybersecurity framework, they also have a tiered maturity ranking, if you will, model themselves. The NIST cybersecurity framework version 2 is a big improvement over version 1. It's, as I have listed here, it's no longer specific to critical infrastructure. So it's really made for all verticals to follow. So even if you don't quite land in critical infrastructure, this is still a great model to follow, or framework to follow and implement. And I'm going to use PCI here as an example about thinking as you're developing your security program and as you're going through your security assessments, viewing your security maturity. No matter what compliance framework you have to adhere to, I think it's good to look closely at what you need to adhere to, right? So PCI, if you're unfamiliar, it's the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. They are really a consortium of the 6 major card brands to ensure that cardholder data is protected. There was a long string at one point in time of credit card data theft, and so PCI matured and grew, and now we see a lot less credit card theft because everybody who stores, processes, or transmits credit card data has to adhere to this through the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. And where I'm going with this is, no matter what framework you need to adhere to, really understand what it's asking. So the quote here is, any merchant, while conducting credit card transactions that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, must apply to the DSS or comply with the DSS. So there are, with any framework, there are always myths, right? And I won't go through all of these, but understand exactly where you stand. If that requires, getting a third-party assessor or someone who is familiar, I'm a QSA, so that's why I use PCI as an example. Right, you might not need someone to come in and give you that AOC, that attestation of compliance, but you can hire third parties if you don't have the means within to come in and do a gap assessment, to ask these questions of, right, there are these myths. We outsource, therefore we have no PCI compliance responsibility. If you have a professional there that you can consult, whether internal or external, you can get through it pretty easily. And then, coming right up on time, I have one more slide. As your program matures and grows, start thinking about implementing a zero trust model here. This table shows the different domains of zero trust, which is identity, devices, networks, applications, and workloads, and data. And we don't need to go through all of it, but you can see along the side there that it's got that same maturity model that goes from traditional up through optimal. And think about having like a zero trust effectiveness assessment done, so you can understand where you sit. This is definitely top of the tier, right? You don't want to aspire to this if you're just starting out, but something to think about as you're building out your security program and developing. I know I went through super fast, but that's what I had, and I wanted to make sure I said everything I wanted to say within 30 minutes. So if there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer, or feel free to reach out to myself or Rob Waite. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. That was like a masterclass right there. And I loved your emphasis on sort of your organization maturing through this process. And I personally am a fan of risk assessments and risk registers. So we have a few questions coming into the chat if you have time to answer
I
them.
do. Yes,
okay, great.
of
So we have a question from John that said, how is structured supporting utilities in Alaska?
Yeah, so I wish I could answer that question. That would be a Rob Waite question. Rob is, as I mentioned, he's our director, but he's also based out of Alaska. He's based in Anchorage, and we have a pretty large presence in Anchorage. And again, whether we, I know that we do work with utilities. I couldn't tell you which off the top of my head, but not just within the GRC department, but we have other practices, as I mentioned. That we work with, and we work all throughout the state as well with state government. But yeah, I wish I could answer that question for you, John. I apologize.
Well, thanks for coming at last minute. I really appreciate it. Another one from John is, how important is it for utilities to have local ownership of cyber risks and local on-site staffing resources?
Well, ownership needs to be, I think, if you mean local, I guess I'm confused by local, but ownership for sure. Any utility should have some sort of program, I think, that expands to, and if we're talking about different sites, it should expand and have oversight over all sites. And what was the second half of the question?
Local on-site staffing resources. So a lot of times we do interact with vendors who are out of state. I think maybe that's what John means, or John, you can put in the chat.
I guess I'm still not 100% clear on the question, but I mean, first off, it's always great to have a local resource. If you're talking about vendors, right? Like we're consultants, as I mentioned, so I'm hired all the time by third parties. It can be really nice to have, depending on what you need, right? In the GRC world, we can do everything over the phone, right? Unless we are performing an actual assessment such as PCI, right, where we need to be on site to visually verify certain controls or processes. In the GRC world, for the most part, you can do everything remotely. When it comes to maybe a security partner who, if you don't have the staffing to say, deal with an emergency, if your firewall goes down, right? And you've got people who are familiar with whatever firewall you have in there, but it breaks and you need someone with that expertise on how to fix it, or how to, roll over to a new firewall, implement a replacement quickly. That can be very, very helpful to have a local resource.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I had a question as well. As you shared a lot about the need for risk assessment and risk registers. Where have you seen these most successfully applied? And then who in an organization is best suited to help do these assessments and monitor this register over time?
Yeah, so it depends on the organization. Different organizations have different ways of doing things, and I can't say that anyone is wrong, because it all depends on budgets, on size. Sometimes sometimes it's all the information security department maintaining registers, developing the registers, right? They're doing it all. They're performing the internal risk assessments, whether it's just a CIS controls, or they're doing a NIST CIS or CSF. They're doing the assessments, understanding where the risks are, understanding, the compensating controls and the residual risk and all that, and maintaining the register. There are also organizations that I work with where information security department has nothing to do with it. There's a whole other risk management division where where maybe there's some collaboration between the two teams. But yeah, sometimes it's just a completely different department.
Yeah, awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. I feel like we learned a lot about how to move through these processes, and you shared it in such great detail. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the invite.
So, well, we had a lot of food for thought today. We covered the basics of IT, OT infrastructure and how to protect them. We explored the anatomy of two cyber attacks. We learned about several cybersecurity research programs that are happening, including developing algorithms and models to help utility operators. We walked through regulations that the Railroad Regulatory Commission, for some reason I always stumble on that one, is developing for cybersecurity and that are open for comment now. And you should consider yourself now informed enough to comment if you didn't feel that earlier. And then we just discussed a lot of methods for preventing and mitigating attacks through configuration management, change management, patching, pen testing, policy creation, and so on. I echo the sentiments of John and Lori in the chat. Thank you for these really fascinating presentations. It's so valuable to hear from experts like we did today. And thank you to our presenters, to John Haverlack for bringing everyone together, to our virtual attendees, you, and to government and event services. They pulled off this event flawlessly, so thank you guys. If you learned something new today, I encourage you to invite your friends and colleagues to join us tomorrow. The more people we have who are cyber informed, the better our state is going to be. So we need everybody. I hope you all took something away from the presentations. And if you'd like to see a sneak peek of what we'll be discussing tomorrow, you can see that on the screen now. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us for the first day of Information Security for Electrical Utilities, hosted by University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and that will start at 8:30 a.m., which is 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Have a great afternoon or evening.